Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to have you back on Midnight Stories. So take a moment to unwind, sit back, and immerse yourself in the captivating tale that awaits. However, before we begin, I kindly ask for your support by giving us a like. Growing up in the small town of Iron River in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, I always loved the outdoors. As a kid, I spent my summer swimming in the cold, clear waters of Lake Michigan, fishing for brook trout in the gurgling streams, and camping under the stars in the dense forests of the Ottawa National Forest. My best friends Nick, Josh, and I were inseparable. Every weekend we'd load up our backpacks with gear and disappear into the woods for days at a time, roughing it in the backcountry. We thought we were invincible. But things changed when I turned 18 and went off to college at the University of Oregon. I studied forestry and spent my free time exploring the rugged, misty forests of the Pacific Northwest. The woods there felt ancient and primordial, huge, gnarled trees dripping with moss, the distant cry of a raven echoing through the fog. It was both beautiful and unsettling. When I graduated, saddled with student loan debt and unable to find a decent-paying job, I convinced Nick and Josh to join me on an epic cross-country camping trip. One last hurrah before we had to grow up and face the real world. We'd hit the most remote wilderness areas in the country, starting in Oregon, then heading to the forests of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and finally ending in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. What I couldn't know then was that we were about to come face to face with an ancient evil lurking in the shadows of the forest, something straight out of the darkest folklore, and that it would change us forever if we survived. We began our journey in mid-June, planning to spend a week trekking through each state's backcountry before moving on to the next destination. First up, the dense, rain-drenched, temperate rainforests of Oregon's coastal range. "Damn, it's like something out of Jurassic Park," Josh said in awe, as we hiked deeper into the old-growth forest of Siuslaw National Forest. Massive Douglas firs and Sitka spruces towered over us, their branches arching together hundreds of feet above our heads to form a thick green canopy. Prehistoric-looking ferns and skunk cabbage sprouted from the spongy, decomposing undergrowth. As the light faded and evening set in, we made camp in a mossy clearing alongside a fast-moving stream. The temperature dropped quickly in the damp air. While Nick and Josh sat around the campfire drinking whiskey, I wandered off into the darkening woods to gather more firewood. Bending to pick up a fallen branch, I suddenly froze. Shattering the stillness came a long, moaning cry that sent chills racing down my spine. It sounded almost human, but not quite. The wail rose in pitch before tapering off with a strangled gurgle. Then silence. Heart-pounding, I grabbed the wood and hurried back to the safety of the fire. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked uneasily. "Hear what?" Nick said. "An elk bugling, maybe? There's a herd around here." An elk. Right, that had to be it. As unsettling as the cry had been, I forced myself to shrug it off. We were in the middle of nowhere, after all. Of course we'd hear strange animal calls. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been something else. Something watching us from out there in the darkness, and that this was only the beginning. The next morning dawned cool and misty. Dew clung to our tents and soaked through our boots as we broke camp. I hadn't slept much, my mind replaying that eerie wail over and over. But in the light of day, it seemed far less menacing. Just a wild animal, I told myself firmly. We hiked deeper into the forest, following faint game trails that snaked between the massive, furrowed tree trunks. By late afternoon, we reached our goal, a remote alpine lake, its surface like polished glass reflecting the snow-capped peaks towering above. "Damn, we've got the whole place to ourselves," Josh crowed excitedly, dumping his pack on the pebbly shore. "Who wants to go for a swim?" "I'm in," Nick said, already yanking off his shirt. Normally I'd have been the first one diving in, but a strange foreboding prickled the back of my neck as I gazed out across the mirrored surface of the water. "I think I'm going to take a pass," I said. "Didn't sleep great last night. Gonna rest up." "Suit yourself," Nick shrugged, wading in. The water barely rippled around his thighs. While they swam, I got a fire going and unpacked our food. The sun inched toward the jagged peaks, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and pink. "Guys, chow time," I eventually called. No response. I walked over to the shore, scanning the lake. Nothing but flat, glassy water stretching out before me. The hairs on my arms stood up. "Nick, Josh, quit messing around." My voice sounded high and thin in the waiting stillness. Silence. Then somewhere out in the middle of the lake, a disturbance in the water. Ripples radiating out, and suddenly Josh's head breaking the surface, mouth stretched wide in a scream. "Help! Nick! Oh, God! It's got Nick!" I charged into the shallows, the icy water stealing my breath. Josh flailed and splashed, eyes rolling wildly. Then in a surge of water he vanished. The surface smoothed, tranquil once more. Alone on the shore, I stood frozen with horror and disbelief. Something had taken them, something in the dark water, pulling them down, down, down. How I made it back to civilization on my own, I'll never know. Those next hours were a panicked blur of crashing through the forest, their final screams ringing in my ears, my mind unable to process the enormity of what I'd just witnessed. I must have looked like a madman when I finally stumbled into a ranger station, raving about some unseen force snatching my friends from the remote mountain lake. I saw the looks the rangers exchanged as they listened to my disjointed story. Looks that said, "This guy's lost it." But they had to investigate. Of course, by the time the search and rescue team reached the lake the next day, there was no sign of Nick or Josh, no tracks or traces, no clues to what had taken them. Like they had vanished without a trace. Trauma, the police said. Delayed drowning, maybe. A terrible accident, to be sure, but these things happened. 2 young men swimming in an ice-cold alpine lake after a few drinks, their muscles probably seized up. Tragic, but not uncommon. I knew none of their explanations could account for the sheer horror I'd seen in Josh's eyes in those final moments, or the feeling of a malevolent presence in those woods, watching us, hunting us. But I had no proof, and so I buried it deep, tried to move on, even as their loss left a void that could never be filled. After the funerals, unable to face the pitying stares and whispers, I fled back to my hometown in Michigan. But even there, the ghosts of that terrible day haunted my every step. I saw their faces in every shadow, heard their dying screams on the wind. I knew it was only a matter of time before the darkness found me again, before I had to face the nightmare that lurked in the forest once more. Months passed. The leaves turned, winter swept in with a vengeance, but even blizzards burying my hometown in deep snow couldn't blot out the memories. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something or I'd go mad, and so I found myself back on the road, chasing the dead ends of obscure folklore and myths, trying to make some kind of sense out of what had happened, to find proof that I wasn't crazy, that Nick and Josh had been victims of something ancient and evil. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, poring over moldering old books in small-town libraries, cornering locals in dive bars to pry out whispered legends of dark things stalking the forest. Everywhere, scraps and fragments of old stories, strange disappearances, trappers vanishing without a trace, inhuman shrieks echoing from the woods. But nothing concrete, until an eccentric old hunter in the remote wilds of northern Wisconsin reluctantly shared a tale passed down in his family for generations. A story of a malevolent spirit said to haunt the forest, the Wendigo. It was once human, he told me, voice low and gravelly. But the hunger, the greed, the evil, it twisted them, turned them into something that ain't human no more. A soulless, ravenous thing, always hungering, pale as bone, teeth like needles, razor claws. It lures the unwary into the deep woods, mimics human voices, calls from the shadows, and then... He trailed off, watery eyes haunted. They say it can't be killed. Fire's the only thing it fears, but God help you if it catches your scent. The Wendigo. I'd heard vague tales, always dismissed as myth, but now, for the first time, I had a name to put to the primordial dread that had stalked us in Oregon. I knew it was only a matter of time before I faced it again. I had to be ready. Blowing the last of my meager savings, I outfitted myself as best I could for what was to come. Layers of thermal gear, fire starters, hatchets, hunting knives, climbing gear. If the Wendigo wanted me, I wouldn't go down without a fight. And so I found myself deep in the ancient, mist-shrouded forests of the Blue Ridge Mountains in early spring, one last stop on my quest for answers before the thing in the shadows finally caught up with me. I'd rented a remote cabin, miles from any other living soul, surrounded by dense stands of hickory, pine, and fir, as far from help as I could get. The first few days passed uneventfully as I explored the area, scouting game trails and dense thickets, but on the fourth night I woke suddenly, heart hammering against my ribs. The fire had burned low, casting eerie shadows on the rough-hewn log walls. From outside, somewhere out in the darkness of the forest, a long wail rose, undulating and inhuman, ending in a rattling, gurgling moan that sent icy tendrils of fear skittering down my spine. I knew that sound, echoing from my darkest memories. It had found me again. Hands shaking, I threw logs on the fire, built it into a roaring blaze. The flames beat back the darkness, pressing against the small cabin's windows. But the Wendigo was out there. I could feel its hunger, its simmering rage. I sat up till dawn, shotgun across my knees, jumping at every creak of trees in the wind. But it didn't attack. It was toying with me, drawing out the game. Sooner or later I'd have to face it. And this time only one of us would walk away. The next day dawned deceptively calm and bright, but even the cheerful birdsong and the breeze sighing through the leafy canopy couldn't dispel the sense of malevolent watchfulness, of a predator's gaze tracking my every move. I knew I couldn't simply hunker down and wait for the Wendigo to make its move. Sooner or later I'd have to take the fight to it, draw it out of hiding, before the waiting drove me mad. By late afternoon I'd fashioned a sturdy makeshift spear, its tip honed to a razor point slick with pine sap to make it burn. With a final deep breath to steel my nerves, I stepped off the cabin's porch and into the waiting forest, following the game trails ever deeper into the shadows, heading toward where I somehow knew it would be. Seconds stretched into minutes. The sinking sun slanted through the trees, painting the forest floor in blood-red streaks. Birdsong faded. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. I felt the weight of its gaze, a pressure between my shoulder blades. A twig snapped behind me, too loud in the stillness. I spun, spear raised. Shadows shifted between the trees, glimpses of desiccated, grayish skin pulled taut over jutting ribs, limbs too long and gaunt to be human, the glint of jagged teeth, of hooked claws. With an unearthly howl, it launched itself at me, faster than anything had a right to move. I threw myself to the side, lashing out with the spear, felt it connect. A high, enraged shriek split the air. Then the Wendigo was on me. We crashed to the ground in a flurry of teeth and blood and needled claws, half-glimpsed horrors, a ravening hunger barely contained in the twisted remnants of a human form. The stench of rotting meat and ancient earth. Claws raked my face, my arms, shredding flesh, but I couldn't feel the pain. A cold, clear focus descended. With a roar of fury and terror, I drove the spear up under its ribs with all my strength. It shrieked, clawing at the shaft, oily black blood spurting. The wound smoked and sizzled. "For Nick and Josh, you bastard!" I snarled through blood-flecked teeth. Wrenching the spear free, I stabbed it down, again and again, till my arms ached and its body stopped its grisly twitching. I staggered back, chest heaving. It lay still, twisted and broken. But even as I watched, flesh knit back together, bones crackled and popped back into place. Dead eyes, pale as a winter sky, snapped open, horribly aware. Oh God, it couldn't be killed. Lurching to my feet, I limped back toward the cabin as fast as my battered body would take me. The crackle of undergrowth behind me, the pant of eager breath, told me it was already hunting once more. I barely made it back to the cabin before my legs gave out. Blood ran into my eyes, soaked my shredded clothes. Somehow I dragged myself inside, barred the door. The creature slammed against it a moment later, howling in fury, a force of pure, distilled malevolence and insatiable hunger. But the thick log walls held, for now. With shaking hands I built up the fire, feeding it broken bits of furniture till it roared and crackled. The old hunter had said it feared only flame. All I could do was pray he'd been right. The thing shrieked and gibbered outside, circling the cabin, seeking a way in as the night deepened. I clutched my spear, knuckles white, struggling not to give in to the insanity of terror threatening to devour me. At some dark hour of the night, an awful silence fell. For a long time I heard nothing. Then, drifting from the distance, the high, desperately welcome wail of sirens. Blue and red lights strobed between the trees as vehicles pulled up outside, shouts pounding at the door. "Hello, anyone here? This is the Forest Service." They broke down the door, took in the scene of carnage. My ravaged face, the blood soaking the floor. I must have looked like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. I tried to explain what I'd seen as the EMTs treated my wounds, begged them to keep the fire burning, to be on guard, that it was still out there, that it would never stop coming. I saw the all too familiar looks on their faces, the slow head shakes. "Trauma," they said, "blood loss and shock. You're safe now." I didn't have the strength to argue. I let them lead me away, pour me into an ambulance. But as we bumped down the rough forest road, I peered out the back windows, back at the dark tree line. For just a moment I glimpsed a pale figure darting between the trunks, fleshless and gaunt, little more than skin stretched over jutting ribs and long bones, needle teeth bared in a hellish grin. It raised one emaciated arm, waved as if in mocking salute, then it vanished back into the darkness of the forest, waiting, always waiting. Sooner or later, I knew, it would find me again, no matter how far I ran. And then the last chapter of this story would finally be written, in blood and madness and the dying light of the fire. My name is Ethan, and I'm 28 years old. I live in a small apartment in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I work as an accountant. Numbers have always made sense to me in a way that people haven't. I like the order and logic of spreadsheets and financial statements, but outside of work, I nurture my passion for the great outdoors. Every chance I get, I load up my beat-up old Subaru with camping gear and head out into the wilderness to unplug from the modern world and immerse myself in nature. This past year has been rough. I went through a bad breakup and have struggled to get my social life back on track. To make matters worse, I made some poor investment decisions and am now drowning in credit card debt, barely making ends meet each month. I've been feeling lost, anxious, and in need of a reset. So when my old college buddies Ryan and Alex suggested a guy's trip to the remote forests of the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, I jumped at the chance. We hadn't seen each other in years, but we shared many fond memories of camping and hiking trips during our university days. Reuniting for an off-grid adventure sounded like the perfect escape from my troubles. After a long day's drive north, we arrived at a small rustic campground on the shores of Lake Superior that would serve as our base camp. As we set up our tents, the towering evergreens swayed ominously in the wind, and waves crashed against the rocky beach. An eerie mist hung low on the water. I tried to shake an uneasy feeling as I reminded myself that this trip was supposed to help me relax, not wind me up tighter. That first evening, we cooked hot dogs over the campfire and caught up on life, reminiscing about the old days and discussing where our paths had taken us since. Ryan was now married with a young daughter and worked as an engineer in Wisconsin. Alex taught high school science in North Carolina and spent his summers leading youth backpacking expeditions. As the night grew late and the fire died down to glowing embers, our conversation turned to the strange and unexplained. Ryan shared a chilling story he had heard about these woods. Apparently, the Ottawa people who originally inhabited this land told of strange creatures that roamed the forest, shadowy humanoid figures with eyes that glowed in the darkness. Alleged sightings over the years described them as tall and emaciated, with long limbs and pale skin. Campers spoke of hearing eerie wails and finding unusual footprints outside their tents. The Ottawa called them Wendigo, an evil spirit that could possess humans and turn them into violent, cannibalistic monsters. Alex and I exchanged nervous glances as Ryan continued in a low, solemn tone. The Wendigo targeted people in moments of weakness, those who were lost, hungry, or struggling emotionally. It would stalk its prey, driving them to madness and desperation before finally revealing itself. According to legend, the surest way to become possessed by a Wendigo was to encounter it in your dreams. I laughed off Ryan's spooky tale as I crawled into my tent, but I couldn't shake the ominous feeling it left me with as I drifted off into a restless sleep. Little did I know that his story was a dark harbinger of the horrors to come. I awoke with a start, my heart pounding, unsure where I was for a moment. Pale morning light filtered through the tent walls as memories of the previous day came flooding back. The long drive setting up camp, Ryan's creepy Wendigo story by the dying fire. I took a few deep breaths to calm myself. It was just a dumb campfire tale, no need to get worked up. Unzipping the tent flap, I was greeted by the serene, misty shoreline of Lake Superior. Ryan and Alex were already up, boiling water for coffee on our propane stove. The events of last night felt hazy, like a strange dream. We ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and discussed our plans for the day. A long hike to scout for a backcountry campsite where we'd stay tonight, deep in the forest and miles from other people. As I shouldered my heavy pack and we set off down the trail, the eerie feeling from last night crept back in. The woods felt different than other forests I'd hiked, unfriendly somehow. Towering hemlocks blocked out the sun, casting everything in a gloomy half-light. A low mist snaked between the mossy trunks. The only sounds were our boots crunching dead leaves and the occasional distant croak of a raven. I kept thinking I caught flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. We hiked for hours, pushing deeper into the wilderness. My mind wandered as I walked, ruminating on my problems back home that I was trying to escape. The mountain of unpaid bills, my demoralizing dead-end job, the gnawing loneliness of the past year. This trip was supposed to help me get away from all that, but I couldn't seem to stop my anxious thoughts from churning. As the light started to slant into late afternoon, I realized I had fallen behind Ryan and Alex, lost in my own head. Picking up my pace to catch up, I suddenly noticed that the trail had grown faint, barely more than a faded line of trampled brush snaking between the endless ranks of trees. Had we gotten off track at some point? A shiver tingled up my spine as I realized how utterly alone and tiny I felt beneath the ancient, disapproving glare of the forest. I called out for Ryan and Alex, but the woods seemed to swallow my words, muffling them to eerie silence. I had started to sweat, my heart thudding faster. Where were they? How could I have lost them? The trail was gone now. No matter which direction I looked, my surroundings were a uniform tangle of trunks and shadow. I was undeniably lost and alone in this vast primordial wilderness. Ryan's words from last night echoed in my mind unbidden. The Wendigo targets people in moments of weakness, those who are lost, hungry, struggling emotionally. A twig snapped sharply behind me. I spun around and saw a flicker of pale motion between distant trees. Breath catching in my throat, I called out in a quavering voice, "Ryan? Alex? Is that you guys?" But only silence answered me. The forest had gone preternaturally still, like a dark, watchful presence holding its breath. I suddenly felt a prickling certainty that something was out there in the shadows, and it was observing me, stalking me. I was alone and lost in the great north woods, miles from civilization. And I couldn't shake the terrifying sense that the forest itself was alive and malevolent, that I had somehow drawn the attention of an ancient, patient evil. As the shadows lengthened and an unseasonable chill crept into the air, I shivered and realized one thing with sinking dread. Night was falling, and I desperately needed to find my friends before darkness swallowed the woods. Because strangely, I knew that if I didn't, I might never make it out of this forest again. I crashed frantically through thickets and deadfalls, wincing as twigs lashed my face, calling for Ryan and Alex until my voice grew hoarse. But the woods gave no answer. Each towering tree looked just like the last, and I soon had to accept that I was hopelessly disoriented. The meager daylight was fading fast, shadows pooling between the endless ranks of trunks. Overhead a raven croaked forlornly, and in my agitated state, it sounded like mocking laughter. Fear churned sickly in my stomach as Ryan's ominous tale haunted me. When I could barely see my own feet beneath me in the gloom, I had to accept bitter defeat. I was lost, alone, and now would have to spend the night in these unsettling woods by myself with no tent or proper gear. But I was an experienced outdoorsman, I sternly told myself. I could get through this. All I needed was a campfire for warmth and protection. And tomorrow, at first light, I'd regain my bearings and reunite with the others. Everything would look better in the clear light of day. Scouring the forest floor, I gathered an armload of deadfall and cleared a small space between the looming evergreens. My lighter was buried deep in my pack, but I eventually fished it out with trembling hands, praying that it would ignite the damp tinder. After a tense minute of coaxing, a weak flame finally bloomed. I carefully nurtured it until I had a modest blaze casting a pool of flickering orange light. The fire's warmth was a small comfort against the eerie night chill settling over the forest. I hunkered close to the wavering flames, feeding it larger sticks, trying to bolster both the fire and my own flagging courage. Overhead, stars glinted coldly in the narrow gaps between the tree crowns. Aside from the crackle of my modest blaze, the woods had fallen preternaturally silent, without even the hum of insects or rustle of night creatures. It was as if the forest was collectively holding its breath in some grim anticipation. Despite my efforts to stay awake and alert, exhaustion from the day's hike and stress wore me down. My thoughts drifted to Megan and our painful breakup, the credit card statements that kept me up at night, the creeping sense that I was wasting my life in a meaningless job. Maybe that's why I'd agreed so eagerly to this trip, a desperate bid to outrun my demons for a little while. But now, shivering alone fireside in the uncaring forest, my personal struggles felt trivial against the deeper menace lurking in these ancient woods, a primordial fear as old as humanity itself. Just as my chin started to nod toward my chest, I heard a distant sound that jolted me to full alertness. A long, wavering cry somewhere between a moan and a howl that sent ice water trickling down my spine. It sounded vaguely human, but not quite. The wail rose in pitch before tapering into haunting silence. The night seemed to darken and press closer around me as my pulse hammered in my throat. Moments later, a second cry reverberated dimly through the trees, further off but no less chilling. Definitely not a coyote or owl. I huddled closer to the fire, now a pitifully small circle of light in the engulfing blackness. My imagination raced, trying to place the unsettling sounds. Could the Wendigo legend actually have some truth to it? Were those the hunting calls of those spindly, pale creatures Ryan had described? Did I actually glimpse one earlier stalking me through the trees? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to slow my ragged breathing. When I opened them, I noticed that the fire had burned low, more crimson embers now than reassuring flame. But before I could feed it more fuel, I glimpsed a pale flicker of motion just at the edge of the weak firelight. My blood turned to ice as a gaunt figure stepped soundlessly out from behind a tree, taller than a man, with skeletal limbs, ghostly skin, and eyes that glinted with feral hunger. I bit back a scream, scrabbling backwards. The creature took another silent step forward, the firelight dancing over its nightmarish frame. There was a hideous, alien intelligence in its sunken gaze, ancient and merciless. I felt the Wendigo's eyes bore into mine, glimpsed the ravenous madness lurking there, and felt my own sanity fray at the edges as I stared into that pale, gaunt face from humanity's darkest folklore. A single thought tolled like a funeral bell in my mind. Now I finally understood the true meaning of horror. I fled blindly into the night, heedless of direction, my pulse a roar of terror in my ears, bursting through thickets of brambles, clawing my way through snarls of deadwood, stumbling over gnarled roots that twisted like grasping fingers across the forest floor. The gurgling rush of a stream cut off my path, shocking me back to a semblance of rationality as I skidded to a stop, gasping, at its shadowed edge. Sobbing for air, my head swiveled wildly, searching for any sign of pursuit. The forest loomed around me, silent and watchful. My campfire was now just the barest crimson smudge flickering distantly between the towering ranks of hemlock trunks. All was still and shadowed, not a pale figure in sight. Could I have imagined that ghastly specter, a hallucination conjured by exhaustion, darkness, and Ryan's ominous fireside story? Logic argued that must be the case. But the image of those feral, ravenous eyes burned in my memory, too starkly lucid to be a mere figment. Deep in my bones, an animal instinct older than reason itself whispered the certain truth. Something was out there in the night, hunting me. Dragging my sleeve across my clammy face, I took stock of my surroundings and shuddered anew. I was now utterly disoriented, more lost than ever in this endless wilderness, and with no fire or proper gear for the night. Fighting down a fresh surge of panic, I focused grimly on the one thing I could control, putting more distance between myself and whatever lurked back there in the darkness. I crashed along parallel to the stream, hoping it would eventually lead me to a lake or river and some point of reference to navigate by. biting cold gnawed deep into my bones. Unseen brambles clawed at my face, the stinging pain almost welcome for how it distracted from the sickening churn of terror in my gut. As I fought through a knee-high tangle of devil's club, their spiny leaves biting through my jeans, I glimpsed a pallid flicker of motion paralleling me among the trees on the far side of the stream. I froze, straining my eyes in the darkness, unsure whether the silhouette was real or imagined, but undeniably, a malevolent presence, ancient and watchful, seemed to lurk just beyond my sight in the gloom-shrouded trunks, goading me onward, not ready to reveal itself fully just yet. Madness crept at the edges of my mind. I could feel it prowling in the shadows of my own psyche like the gaunt creature stalking me through the forest. We're all just one bad night away from insanity, I thought wildly, a single glimpse behind the veil of a dark and uncaring universe. Shaking my head violently, I redoubled my pace, forcing thoughts of home and needing to see my family again to eclipse the corrosive despair. I pictured my dingy apartment back in Pittsburgh, ugly wallpaper and leaky faucets suddenly nostalgically inviting. Even my sterile office cubicle seemed like a bastion of sanity and safety, numbers marching neatly in orderly rows and columns. Just then I stumbled into a small moonlit clearing and my heart lurched in my chest. A weathered cabin huddled at the clearing's center, boards canted and roof sagging from winters of heavy snow, a rickety porch draped in shadow. Part of me recoiled from the eerie scene, but the desperate need for shelter and walls and something of human origin won out. I hesitantly approached the door, my knock swallowed by the sepulchral night. "Hello?" I called, hating the tremor in my voice. "Is anyone home? I could really use some help." Then the door's rusty hinges shrieked and it yawned open with a drawn-out creak, revealing only darkness within. But as my eyes adjusted, I glimpsed the shimmer of pale, gaunt limbs and a feral glint of sunken eyes. My blood turned to ice as I stared into the face of nightmare, and the horrible truth crashed over me. I hadn't outrun the Wendigo. I had stumbled right into its lair. The Wendigo's fetid breath washed over me, reeking of blood and decay as it loomed in the doorway. Up close it was even more horrific, emaciated yet muscular, elongated limbs tapering to wicked black talons, a nightmare fusion of famine and unnatural strength. This close I glimpsed the tatters of clothing and realized with fresh horror that this creature had once been human, before it transformed into the gaunt monstrosity before me. I turned and sprinted madly into the night, the Wendigo's hissing snarl dogging my heels. I crashed blindly through brambles that bit into my flesh, slicing my face and hands as I ran in mindless terror. The creature bounded after me, effortless and silent as a wolf, the forest's shadows parting like water before it. We danced a morbid waltz through the moonlit trees, hunter and prey, the Wendigo almost lazily matching my frantic pace but always lurking at the edges of my sight. It was playing with me, I realized with renewed horror, savoring my unconstrained terror and desperation. My legs burned and my lungs sobbed for air, but I ran on, primal survival instinct eclipsing all reason. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see gaining ground behind me. Crashing through the underbrush, I focused only on putting one foot in front of the other, on drawing one more ragged breath. But I knew I couldn't outrun the creature forever. Already my pace was flagging, my body pushed past its limits. In desperation, I veered toward where the trees thinned out, praying it meant I was nearing the lakeshore or a road, some avenue of escape. Bursting from the tree line, my heart plummeted as I skidded to a halt at the crumbling edge of a sheer cliff, waves crashing on jagged rocks far below. Spinning around, I searched for another route, but the Wendigo was suddenly there, slipping silently from the shadows to block my path. In the moonlight, I could see its pale, gaunt frame more clearly, all sinew and emaciated limbs. Intelligent yet inhuman eyes glittered in its skull-like face as it stalked slowly closer, relishing my obvious terror and despair. I was cornered with nowhere left to run, but as it stretched one clawed hand toward me, a sudden beam of light sliced through the darkness, pinning the creature in its glare. Squinting against the brightness, I made out two human silhouettes advancing through the trees, flashlight beams sweeping before them. "Ethan!" The achingly welcome voice was Ryan's, edged with worry. "Are you out here? Answer us." Hardly daring to breathe, I risked a glance at the Wendigo, and felt a shock. The creature had vanished as if it were never there. Blinking against the residual dazzle of the flashlights, I scanned the tree line, but no trace remained of the nightmarish entity. It was as if the light itself had banished the creature back to whatever dark realm had spawned it. "I'm here," I called, my voice cracking with relief. "Oh, thank God you found me!" Ryan and Alex crashed out of the trees, their faces mirrors of deep concern and barely repressed fear. "Dude, we've been searching for hours." Ryan pulled me into a rough embrace as Alex anxiously checked me over for injuries. "What happened to you? We thought we heard screams and, I don't know, other weird sounds out in the woods." I opened my mouth, the full story of my monstrous ordeal rising to my lips, but I hesitated. Already the night's events had taken on a hazy, feverish quality in my mind, as if I had just awoken from a vivid nightmare. Had it really happened at all? Or had the forest's eerie atmosphere and the fireside Wendigo tale simply ignited my overactive imagination? The guys were already on edge. Did I really want to ratchet their anxiety even higher by raving about a pale, demonic creature stalking me through the trees? A creature that had apparently vanished into thin air. I'm not sure, I finally said. I guess I got lost and panicked. I thought I saw... Well, it doesn't matter. I'm just glad you found me. Ryan and Alex exchanged a wordless look, clearly not fully convinced, but to my relief they didn't push for details. "Come on, let's get you back to camp," Alex said gently, taking my arm to guide me as if he expected me to collapse at any moment. "We'll hike back out to the road at first light and cut this trip short. I think we've all had enough of these woods." I simply nodded, suddenly too exhausted to speak. But as I let my friends lead me back through the trees, I couldn't resist one last look over my shoulder into the shadowed forest behind us. Were those two faintly glowing eyes I glimpsed peering from behind a tangle of trunks? Watching us depart with cold, ageless patience, secure in the knowledge that its forest would always be waiting? Or was it simply a trick of the moonlight and my own strained, overreactive mind? I shuddered and hurried on, eager to put this nightmarish wilderness behind me. But as the trees closed in around us once more, I couldn't shake one last chilling thought. If the Wendigo was real and could truly possess those who encountered it, who was to say the creature hadn't already sunk its claws into my mind? That even now, a seed of insidious madness might be taking root in my psyche, waiting to sprout and grow in the months ahead? What if the true horror was only just beginning? The morning sun slanted through the grimy windows of my cramped studio apartment, catching motes of dust swirling lazily in the wan light. I sat hunched at my tiny kitchen table, staring blearily into a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The blare of morning traffic drifted up from the street below, the city going about its business, blissfully unaware of the shadows that lurked in the forgotten corners of the world. It had been 2 months since that nightmarish night in the northern woods, 2 months of jumping at shadows, of lying awake in the dark listening for the scrape of claws at my door. The first few weeks back had been the hardest. I'd thrown myself into work, trying to lose myself in the comforting banality of spreadsheets and financial reports, but every time I closed my eyes I saw that pale, gaunt face looming out of the darkness, felt the Wendigo's fetid breath on the back of my neck. I knew Ryan and Alex were worried about me. Our friendship had been strained since the trip. We'd all dealt with the aftermath in our own ways. Alex had channeled his lingering unease into his teaching, becoming a favorite among his students for his intense, immersive lessons. Ryan had thrown himself into his family, taking his daughter on long hikes in the safe, tame woods near their suburban home, and I had simply withdrawn, pulling away from calls and texts, isolating myself in my fortress of solitude. But slowly, gradually, I was putting the pieces of myself back together. Oddly, it was the little moments of connection that helped the most. A brief chat with the barista at my local coffee shop, a shared smile with a stranger on the subway. Each one felt like a tiny victory, a defiant stand against the darkness. Because in the end, that was the Wendigo's true power, I'd come to realize. Not the rending of flesh or gnashing of teeth, but the rending of our humanity. The insidious whisper that we are alone in the dark, that the world is a cold and uncaring place. But it was a lie. There was still light in the world, still warmth and human connection, if you knew where to look. I sipped my cold coffee, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste. Then I opened my laptop, jaw set with quiet determination. The Wendigo may have sunk its claws into my mind, but I wasn't going to let it win. I would claw my way back to the light, one day at a time, starting with settling at least one lingering demon, the looming specter of my finances. I pulled up my online banking portal, steeling myself, and blinked in shock. The balance was far healthier than it had any right to be. Scanning recent transactions, I spotted a deposit from Ryan, then another from Alex, enough to keep me afloat while I got back on my feet. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes as I stared at the screen. Even after everything, my friends still had my back. They'd tethered a lifeline to guide me out of the darkness. In that moment, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I knew I still had a long road ahead of me, that there would still be nights where I awoke in a cold sweat, heart pounding. But I also knew I had the strength to walk that road, and more importantly, that I wouldn't be walking it alone. The Wendigo had tried its best to unravel the bonds between us, to fray the fabric of our humanity. But it had failed. In the end, it was our connections to each other that would see us through the darkness. The ancient evil in the forest was strong, but it was no match for the light we carried within us. I stood up, mug in hand, and walked to the window, looking out over the bustling city. Somewhere out there, a Wendigo lurked in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. But it would not be me. I had a life to live, and I intended to live it well, to meet my demons head-on, strengthened by the knowledge that I was not alone, and bit by bit, to banish the darkness with the light of human connection. It wouldn't be easy, but I was ready for the fight. After all, if there was one thing I'd learned from my night of terror in the forest, it was this: the scariest monsters are the ones we carry within us. But in the end, it is also us who gets to decide how their story ends. I smiled and took a sip of coffee, the morning sun warming my face. Then I turned and walked out my front door, ready to face the day ahead. The five of us had been planning this camping trip for months. Me, Jack, Ryan, Mike, and Chris, buddies since high school, looking for one last adventure together before we all went our separate ways after college graduation. We decided on a week-long trek deep into the remote wilderness of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I had grown up in a small town in Michigan's Lower Peninsula, spending countless hours exploring the local woods as a kid. I loved being immersed in nature, getting away from the noise and distractions of modern life. When my friends suggested this ambitious trip, pushing ourselves to the limit in some of the country's most rugged backcountry, I eagerly agreed. Little did I know that we were about to get far more adventure than we bargained for, that the local legends I had heard whispers about growing up, dark tales of strange creatures and sinister forces lurking in the ancient forests, were more than just stories. That in just a few days my entire understanding of the world, of what's real and what's possible, would be shattered beyond repair. But in that moment, as we gathered our gear and supplies, spirits high with anticipation, all I could think about was spending quality time with some of my oldest friends before our lives inevitably diverged. We had been through so much together, heartbreaks and triumphs, laughter and tears. This trip felt like a fitting capstone to this chapter of our lives. If only I had known it might be the last time I would see some of them alive, that the bonds of our friendship were about to be tested in the most horrific way imaginable. But ignorance was bliss as we set off, making the long drive north to the trailhead where we would begin our journey into the unknown. Along the way, we made a few stops to pick up some last-minute supplies, extra batteries for our flashlights, some energy bars, and trail mix for snacking. As we traveled further from civilization and the towns got smaller and further apart, a sense of unease started to creep into my gut. I shrugged it off as just nerves or anticipation. We reached the access road by late afternoon. It was little more than a gravel path, overgrown with weeds, that stretched off into the rapidly darkening forest. According to the map, it was still several miles to the trailhead where we planned to camp for the night before starting our hike the next morning. As Chris maneuvered his SUV over the bumps and ruts, branches scraping disconcertingly against the windows. We started joking to break the tension, trading ghost stories and urban legends from our respective hometowns, and speculating what we might encounter out here in the middle of nowhere. "I heard there are packs of wolves in some of these woods," Mike said. "Like bigger than normal wolves, more aggressive too." "Nah, I bet it's Bigfoot," Jack replied with a grin. "Maybe we'll catch a blurry glimpse of him and finally prove he exists." I forced a chuckle, but inside my sense of foreboding only grew stronger. The stories from my youth were coming back to me now with startling clarity. Tales of people venturing into the woods and never returning, of strange sounds in the night and sightings of unnatural creatures. At the time I had dismissed them as silly superstitions. Now I wasn't so sure. We reached the empty trailhead parking lot just as the last traces of daylight were fading. Hurriedly we unloaded our gear, set up our tents, and built a small fire. The night settled over us, a cloak of impenetrable darkness pierced only by the dancing flames and the beams of our flashlights. Strange animal calls echoed from the void around us. Huddled around the campfire, we cooked some hot dogs on sticks, cracked open some beers, and tried to recapture our earlier excitement. But an ineffable heaviness now hung in the air, an almost primal sense of being watched, of not being welcome here. I couldn't quite put it into words, couldn't tell if my friends felt it too, or if it was just my imagination running wild. If I had heeded my intuition then, if we had simply packed up our things, driven away, and never looked back, maybe things would have turned out differently. Maybe the horrors to come could have been avoided. But in that moment, slightly buzzed and not wanting to wimp out in front of my buddies, I pushed my unease down deep inside me and tried to focus on the good times ahead. As we zipped ourselves into our tents that night, the first ominous howl pierced the air. High and quavering, it sounded close, too close. Mike made a joke about it probably being a coyote, but I thought I detected a note of tension in his voice that matched my own. The howl came again, even closer, followed by another and another. Soon the night was alive with the eerie chorus. None of us slept very well that night, and that was only the beginning. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly as we emerged from our tents, low clouds sheathing the tops of the towering pines around us. The events of the previous night almost felt like a dream. Surely those unearthly sounds were just coyotes or wolves, right? Nothing to be alarmed about out here in the untamed wilderness. At least that's what we tried to convince ourselves as we scarfed down some instant oatmeal and broke camp. But as we shouldered our heavy backpacks and set off down the muddy trail, I couldn't shake my lingering unease. The forest felt different in the gloomy daylight, almost malevolent, like we were trespassing in a place we didn't belong. The rough path overgrown with roots and vegetation led steadily uphill, deeper and deeper into woods. "Hey, did you see that?" Ryan suddenly asked after about an hour of hiking, pointing off into the dense tangle of underbrush to our right. We all stopped and followed his gaze, but none of us spotted anything out of the ordinary. "See what?" Jack asked. "I thought I saw—" "Never mind, it's nothing. Let's keep going," Ryan replied. But I noticed he kept casting nervous glances over his shoulder after that. As the day wore on, the drizzle thickened into a penetrating chilly rain, cutting through our rain gear and dampening our spirits. According to the map and compass, we still had a ways to go before reaching the first backcountry campsite. The path ascended a series of steep hills and rocky outcroppings, the monotony broken only by the occasional stream crossing or small waterfall. During one break, huddling under a makeshift shelter made from a tarp to eat some beef jerky and trail mix, Mike remarked that he hadn't seen a single sign of civilization all day. No footprints, fire rings, or litter indicating other hikers. Unusual for such a scenic area, even if it was remote. "Well, that's kind of the whole point," Chris said, "to get away from the crowds and experience some real solitude." "I know, but doesn't it feel like we're the only people for 100 miles in any direction?" Mike pressed. "It's a bit eerie, that's all." Now that he mentioned it, the absence of any human traces was a bit disconcerting. Combined with the steadily worsening weather and the gloom of the forest, an unmistakable air of isolation and vulnerability crept over us. We hurried to pack up and get moving again, simply to have something to focus on other than our growing discomfort. Shortly after that, we made a chilling discovery. Right in the middle of the trail, illuminated by the weak light filtering through the rain-soaked canopy, was a large paw print in the mud. Except paw didn't really do it justice. The impression was as wide as my splayed hand, and the individual claw marks at the tips were inches long. It reminded me of a bear track, except bigger, much bigger. We all exchanged uneasy glances. There weren't supposed to be grizzly bears in Michigan, right? And even if there were, what kind of bear could possibly leave a print that massive? When I knelt down to examine it more closely, I noticed a strange pattern of smaller markings surrounding the main track, almost like arcane symbols. A shudder ran through me that had nothing to do with the rain or the cold. Maybe we should head back, Jack suggested, trying to keep his voice steady. This doesn't feel right. For a split second, we all considered it. The thought of just turning around, returning to the world we knew and understood, was powerfully tempting. But some combination of stubbornness, peer pressure, and misplaced bravado made us push onwards in the end. Mike reasoned that whatever animal made that track was probably long gone by now, and after coming all this way, none of us wanted to admit defeat without reaching our goals. So we nervously continued, hyper-alert for any other signs of the creature, as the path wound deeper into the sodden grayness. With every passing minute, every squelching step, I felt like we were crossing an invisible threshold into a primordial world, governed by forces we couldn't begin to comprehend. A world that was perhaps better left undisturbed. After several more arduous miles, we straggled into the backcountry campsite by a small lake, utterly exhausted and chilled to the bone. It took us longer than it should have to get tents set up and a fire started with numb fingers and waterlogged kindling. To our immense relief, the rest of the evening passed without incident. There were no more unearthly howls, no signs of that impossibly large creature besides the single paw print we had stumbled across. Maybe, I dared to hope, it had all been a product of our overactive imaginations and the oppressive atmosphere of the deep woods. But that fragile optimism shattered in the darkest hours of the night when I awoke suddenly to the sounds of screams and the unmistakable sensation that something was terribly, terribly wrong. I jolted upright in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding in the darkness. For a disoriented moment I thought perhaps the screams had just been part of a nightmare, some lingering fragment of dream. But then they came again, long, wavering shrieks of mortal terror and agony that sent ice water flooding through my veins. And judging by their volume, they were coming from the tent right next to mine. Mike and Chris's tent. Frantically, I fumbled for the zipper of my tent flap and spilled out into the campsite. The fire pit was little more than glowing coals, but as my eyes adjusted, I could see a scene of utter chaos in the flickering light. Mike and Chris's tent had collapsed, the shape of their thrashing bodies straining against the fabric as they cried out. And something else was in there with them, a hulking, snarling black form with glowing red eyes that hinted at an impossible size. I dimly registered Ryan and Jack stumbling out of their tent as well, the horror in their exclamations mirroring my own shock. Before any of us could react further, there was one last piteous shriek, and then a wet, ripping sound that made my stomach turn. The screams stopped abruptly. Something large rustled inside the ruined tent, and then, to my further revulsion, began audibly feeding. Oh my God, Ryan was saying over and over, his voice high and hysterical. What is that thing? I had no words to answer. Some deep, primordial instinct had taken over my body, flooding my system with adrenaline. Without thinking, I lunged for my backpack, still with most of my gear inside, and swung it over my shoulders. We have to get out of here now, I yelled at Jack and Ryan. Into the woods, it's our only chance. I didn't wait for a response before plunging into the dark tangle of trees, thorns tearing at my clothes. Blind, mindless panic carried me forward, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or destination. Just away, far away from the nightmare behind us. After a few minutes, when the burn in my lungs and legs made it impossible to run any further, I stumbled to a stop and looked back. I could no longer see the faint glow of our campfire. The woods were utterly still. No screams, no sounds of pursuit. I strained my ears but couldn't hear Jack or Ryan either. An awful sinking feeling grew in my gut as I contemplated the implications. Was I now alone out here? Had we all just scattered in different directions? But before I could fully process this new, horrific development, an alien sound shattered the quiet night. It was vaguely similar to the howls we had heard the previous evening, except deeper, more guttural, and filled with a savage, triumphant bloodlust that sent a bolt of primitive terror straight down my spine. It was coming from the direction of our abandoned camp, and judging by the way it echoed off the hills, bouncing and overlapping itself, it wasn't just a single source. There were multiple creatures out there, and they were on the hunt. I broke into a stumbling run again, whipped onward by a fresh jolt of fear. The forest had become a hostile labyrinth, every shadow a lurking threat. Tree branches snatched at me like claws, and I had to bite back a scream every time I brushed against something in the dark. But far worse than the physical obstacles were the noises that began to grow behind me, getting steadily louder. Rustling and snapping of vegetation, excited snarls and whines like a pack of predators zeroing in on frightened prey. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see gaining on me, but I could feel the prickle on the back of my neck that meant something was watching me, stalking me. Whatever these creatures were, wolves or bears or something infinitely more sinister, they clearly knew this terrain far better than I did, and they could smell my fear, using it to track me through the pitch black. I felt like a mouse in a brutal game of cat and mouse, hopelessly outmatched and out of my depth. My foot caught a root, and I went sprawling, my backpack flying, the breath knocked out of my lungs. I frantically rolled over, expecting fangs to sink into my flesh at any moment, but instead saw 2 pinpricks of light approaching in the distance, bobbing and weaving between the trees. Flashlights? Jack? Ryan? I called out desperately. Is that you? A wave of relief crashed through me as I recognized my friends' panting voices calling back. Apparently, we had all instinctively run in the same direction. I staggered upright and hurried toward them on badly shaking legs. But our reunion was tainted by shared grief and ongoing terror. In broken half-sentences, they filled me in on what little more they had seen. The hulking thing that had butchered Mike and Chris was like no animal any of us had ever witnessed. When it bounded out of the wrecked tent and loped off into the forest, Ryan had gotten a glimpse of its full body in the firelight and said it almost seemed to be walking upright at times, like some twisted werewolf from a horror movie. And now several of the beasts were undoubtedly still out here, tracking us. We had no weapons, no shelter, no idea where we were in relation to the trail or the road. I cursed myself for ever agreeing to this trip, for ignoring the dread that had nagged me from the start. Our hubris and complacency had led us straight into a deadly trap with no obvious way out. But we couldn't just give up. Mike and Chris deserved better than that, and I sure as hell wasn't about to lay down and die in this godforsaken forest without a fight. I still had my backpack with a bit of gear, and Jack and Ryan had managed to grab theirs as well. We would have to rely on our wits and diminishing adrenaline to survive the night. And so, with the baying of the creatures still echoing far too close for comfort, we fled deeper into the shadowed woods, not knowing what further horrors lay ahead of us. The only thing we knew for certain, we were now playing by an older, wilder set of rules, and the odds were decidedly not in our favor. I'd like to say that things got better after that initial horrific attack, that we managed to find a moment to catch our breaths and get our bearings. But the truth is, we remained in a state of constant mortal terror, a nightmare from which there seemed to be no waking. The forest itself seemed to turn against us, determined to thwart our escape at every turn. We quickly became hopelessly disoriented, unsure which direction the road lay. The clouds obscured any stars that could aid in navigation, and our compass seemed to spin aimlessly, giving no clear bearing. It was as if some unseen force was deliberately clouding our minds, herding us inexorably deeper into the wilderness. Several times we blundered into marshy, sucking bogs that threatened to drag us down into their rank depths. Thorny underbrush tore at our skin and clothes, leaving us bleeding from 100 small cuts. And always there was the feeling of being watched, stalked, toyed with by an intelligence far greater than our own. We snatched moments of fitful rest only when sheer exhaustion demanded it, slumping against tree trunks with our hearts still racing. But every time we closed our eyes, gruesome images assaulted us. Visions of Mike and Chris's final moments, the ravenous creature that had torn them apart. We jerked awake over and over, unsure if the sourceless rustling and creaking around us was real or imagined. As if the physical hardships and mental strain weren't enough, it soon became apparent that we were being hunted by more than just the creatures. Something dark and insidious was seeping into our minds, exploiting our mounting dread and despair. It started as a faint whispering at the edges of my consciousness, easy to dismiss as the product of an overstressed mind. But as the night wore on, the voice grew louder, taking on a pervasive quality that I couldn't shut out no matter how hard I tried. "You're going to die out here," it hissed venomously, "just like your friends. One by one the beasts will rip you to shreds and feast on your flesh. It's inevitable." I clapped my hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The whispering seemed to emanate from inside my own skull. Judging by my friends' haunted expressions, they were experiencing the same disturbing phenomenon. "There is no escape," the voice continued relentlessly. "You are miles from any hope of rescue. No one will ever find your bodies. Give in to the fear. Let it consume you." With an effort of will, I wrenched my mind away from the insidious murmuring. I couldn't let it overwhelm me, sap what remained of my fragile resolve. But it was clear that whatever malign force lurked in this forest could not only hunt us physically, but mentally as well, preying on our deepest anxieties. Desperation and dwindling hope made time seem to slow to a torturous crawl. Minutes felt like hours like eternities as we plodded onward in a daze of misery, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making us flinch. My muscles burned and my lungs ached, but it was nothing compared to the acid bite of Jack's dire question. What if we're just walking in circles? What if there is no way out and this is just some sort of sick game to that thing? I had no reassuring response to offer. With each passing moment, the possibility that we had stumbled into not just a physical territory, but a spiritual domain not meant for humans felt more and more plausible. A place where the normal rules of nature held no sway. As if to punctuate that grim thought, an abrupt change in the cadence of baying and howling in the distance reached my ears. The undulating cries took on a new note, one of triumph and imminent attack. They had found us again, and this time sounded much, much closer. "Run," I croaked through a parched throat. "We have to move now." Galvanized by pure survival instinct, we crashed blindly through the underbrush, half falling down a brushy ravine in our haste. Branches slapped our faces and hidden rocks turned our ankles, but we barely felt them, too focused on the sounds of large bodies bounding through the woods behind us, closing the gap with horrifying speed. Then Ryan, slightly ahead of Jack and I, let out a sudden cry, but it was one of surprise and cautious relief, not pain or fear. "I see a light. I think there's a cabin up ahead." A structure, even a dilapidated outpost, meant a chance of shelter and defensible walls. We surged toward it in a final burst of desperate energy. The ramshackle cabin appeared out of the darkness, its windows glowing dimly from some sourceless interior light. Rotten wooden steps groaned under our weight as we leaped onto the sagging porch. I wrenched open the door, praying it wasn't locked. Mercifully, it swung open and we piled through, slamming it behind us. The single room was barren and thick with dust, cobwebs stringing the ceiling. Besides a rickety chair and table, the only feature was a cold stone hearth. But I hardly registered the details, too busy frantically dragging the table in front of the door as a barricade while Jack and Ryan shoved the chair under the handle as a wedge. No sooner had we finished our crude fortifications than a heavy weight slammed into the walls, rattling the entire cabin on its foundation. I yelped in shock, retreating to the center of the room as the impacts intensified, claws raking across the outer planks, a chorus of snarls and guttural roars shaking the night. We had reached a temporary refuge, but for how long? The creatures had us surrounded and besieged, the door and fragile walls the only things holding them at bay. How sturdy was this building? Would it withstand a sustained assault by beasts of unnatural strength? And what dark surprises might lurk inside it? There was no time to ponder those dire questions. The creatures battered the cabin with relentless fury, dust motes dancing in the air with each shuddering impact. Paralyzed with primordial fear, we could only huddle together and pray that the long claws rending the wood couldn't find a way in. But the true threat, I would soon discover, came from the innocuous stone hearth. I had assumed it was long cold, unused for years. But as I stared in numb horror, faint lines began to appear in the soot caked on its surface. Lines that resolved into eldritch symbols pulsing with a glimmer of unwholesome purple light. Symbols that looked unnervingly similar to those we had seen around the massive paw print on the trail earlier. With dawning comprehension came the icy realization. The cabin wasn't a sanctuary. It was a sacrificial altar, and by entering it, we hadn't escaped the trap. We had sprung it. The hideous implication struck me like a hammer blow. This was no coincidence or stroke of bad luck that had led us to this decrepit cabin. Sinister intent had guided our every nightmarish step, driving us with ruthless calculation to this very room, this very moment. We weren't just being hunted, we were being harvested. But before the reality could sink in, before I could voice a warning to Jack and Ryan, new motion within the stone fireplace arrested my attention. The plumes of dust hanging in the air began to stir and swirl as if sifted by an unseen hand. Then, to my uncomprehending disbelief, the motes coalesced into a face. It hovered in midair, vaguely human in shape but gaunt and hollow-cheeked to the point of emaciation. A ghostly purple light smoldered in the depths of its empty eye sockets, blazing with cruel awareness. When it spoke, its voice was the papery whisper of long-dead leaves scudding across a moonlit crypt. At last, fresh blood and bones crossed my threshold, it sighed in obscene satisfaction. So many years I have waited, gathering strength in this between place, preparing for the glorious hunt. My tongue felt welded to the roof of my mouth. I could only gape in slack-jawed horror as the phantasmic visage literally drank in my terror, its form solidifying, gaining substance from my fear. What are you?" I finally managed to croak. The thing's lipless mouth curved into a vile approximation of a smile. "I am the spirit of this land, ancient and eternal. I am the primal fear that lurks in the hearts of all prey. I am the shadow cast by the moon, the mist that clings to the bogs, the wraith that stalks the night. And you, dear children, are my sacrificial lambs." Through the fog of my stupefaction, I dimly registered that the assault on the cabin walls had ceased. An awful intuition rose in my mind. The beasts had only been driving us here all along, into the lair of their master. "Why us?" Ryan's strangled whisper mirrored my own dazed incomprehension. "What do you want?" "Because you were foolish enough to trespass in my domain, because your blind arrogance amuses me, because your pain and fear is sweet nectar to my lips." The nightmarish entity drifted closer, its tattered shroud of shadows undulating hungrily. "As for what I want to savor your despair as I flay your minds, to feel your sanity unravel as I peel it apart layer by layer, to feed on your life force until nothing remains but gibbering husks." Bile rose in my throat, an eternity of torment, of having our very essences devoured and corrupted, seemed a fate infinitely worse than a quick death under rending claws. And in that moment of blackest revelation, I knew with numb certainty it had all been inevitable from the moment we set foot in these cursed woods, that it wasn't poor decisions or random chance that had brought us to this fate. The spirit of this place had orchestrated every step of our doom in an intricate and malevolent dance as foreordained as the phases of the moon. Fight or flight instinct still screamed at me to run, to try for the door, but my muscles refused to obey. I was a hair frozen beneath the gaze of a cobra, unwilling mesmerism rooting me to the spot. Helpless tears tracked down my cheeks as I contemplated an existence more hellish than I could ever conceive. But then, through the haze of my despair, I noticed something. The runes etched into the fireplace, the very symbols that seemed to grant the wraith its power, had begun to flicker and dim. The more the malevolent spirit manifested, the more energy it expended, the weaker their eldritch light grew. As if its presence here, on this side of the void, was only made possible by the mystical conduit they provided, and without that anchor, that foothold. A desperate idea kindled in my mind then, born of the absolute certainty that if I did nothing we would suffer a fate more horrific than death. With my last ounce of defiance, I lunged for the dwindling embers of our fire and snatched up a half-charred log, ignoring the flash of pain as it seared my hands. The wraith let loose a hiss of outrage, its form billowing violently. "Impudent child, you dare?" But there was a shrill edge to its fury, a tinge of what almost sounded like fear. Before it could fully react, I swung the log with all my might at the fireplace, directly at the heart of the pulsing ward runes. The impact shattered the weakened stone, sending shards exploding outward. Instantly, the purple light surged, writhing across the masonry as if in mortal agony. A piercing shriek rattled the window panes. I struck again and again, chipping away at the sigils even as the wraith howled and clawed at my face with talons of shadow. White-hot pain lanced through my head, 1,000 nightmarish visions threatening to pull me under. But I clung to consciousness like a drowning man, flailing blindly in a haze of flying soot and rock dust. Then, with a final crunch, the last rune guttered out like a candle flame snuffed by an unseen breath. The wraith's cry rose to an ear-splitting crescendo, its form shredding apart at the edges as it wailed its thwarted malice. The unnatural wind whipping through the cabin reached gale force, slamming me backwards into the wall. Dimly, over the eldritch maelstrom, I heard Jack and Ryan shouting, calling my name. Then, as abruptly as it began, the chaos ceased. An unnatural silence descended, so deep and still that for a harrowing moment I thought I had gone deaf. But then I heard it. The slow, welcome creaks and groans of a normal forest at night. The oppressive atmosphere of dread and doom was simply gone, vanished along with the wraith and its sigil-spun prison. Shaking, drained but alive, I hauled myself painfully to my feet amid the ruins and embraced my ashen-faced friends. We had survived an unreality more terrifying than any sane mind could comprehend. But our ordeal wasn't quite finished. We still had to escape these shadow-haunted woods and carry word of what transpired to the outside world, in solemn memory of those we had lost. The journey back to the trailhead was a stumbling, nightmarish ordeal that I recall only in the haziest of fragments, miles that felt like lifetimes, jumping at every snapping twig, clinging to the faintest hint of dawn on the horizon like a talisman against the horrors of the night. Every time I blinked, I saw the after-image of the wraith's baleful visage or flashes of the grisly fates of Mike and Chris. Somehow, eventually, we staggered back to Chris's waiting car, falling into an exhausted silence as we sped back toward the nearest vestige of civilization. The same unspoken question hung over us like a pall. How could we possibly find the words to convey the full depths of the nightmare we had endured and still preserve our tenuous hold on sanity? Who would believe us? In the end, I'm still not sure what I believe. If the whole experience was some shared delusion born of isolation and primal paranoia, or if we really had become pawns in a hunt as old as fear itself, orchestrated by a malign intelligence beyond the scope of the rationale. I only know that not a single night has passed since that I don't bolt awake in a cold sweat, the ragged screams of the dying echoing in my ears, desperate to assure myself that the glint of purple light in the darkness is just a trick of an overstrung mind. But when the wind rattles the panes and the branches scratch at the window like claws, and the moon rides high and baleful in a starless sky, doubt gnaws at me with an icy dread, because the one thing I know with crystalline certainty is that places like those we dared tread exist, primeval pockets of land that have never known the taming touch of human civilization, and in those shadowed silent reaches, things older than time itself hold sway, as patient and pitiless as the turning of the seasons. So I leave this account as a warning and a reminder. To any who find their hubris and curiosity drawing them to test themselves against the denizens of the wild, look elsewhere for your trials of courage. For there are some places man was never meant to walk, some mysteries that should remain buried beneath the dead leaves and loam, because in the deepest, darkest depths of the forest, the only rule is that of fang and claw, and if you stray from the light you may discover that you are not the hunter after all, but the prey. The days and weeks following our escape from the forest were a blur of police interviews, fruitless searches, and the agonizing task of breaking the news to Mike and Chris's devastated families. At first we tried to tell the truth, to describe the nightmarish entities that had hunted us and the arcane horrors that haunted that forest. But the skepticism and incredulity in the eyes of the authorities quickly made it clear that revealing the full extent of what we had witnessed would only damage our credibility and likely our perceived sanity. So, as much as it pained me, we amended our story. We claimed that Mike and Chris had been attacked by unusually large and vicious bears, their bodies dragged off into the woods. It was still a difficult narrative to swallow, given the lack of any remains, but far more plausible than the eldritch truth. Perhaps that's why, despite multiple intensive searches, no trace of our friends was ever found, as if the forest itself had swallowed all evidence that they had ever existed. When the authorities called off the official rescue efforts after a week, I couldn't even summon much surprise. Some bitter, intuitive part of me knew we would never see Mike or Chris again, in this life or any other. In a way, not having the finality of recovered bodies made the grieving process even more excruciating. Their families vacillated between despairing acceptance and raging denial, demanding answers we couldn't provide. Jack, Ryan, and I drifted apart under the weight of our shared trauma, each grappling with the impossible memories in our own way. I threw myself into researching the history and folklore of those woods, desperate to find some context for what had happened to us. Late into the night, I pored over obscure texts and websites, learning far more than I ever wanted to know about the shadowy corners of the world where myth and reality intersect. I discovered that the area had been shunned by indigenous tribes for generations before European settlers ever arrived, that it was known in certain circles as a thin place, where the veil between our world and far darker realms was said to wear precariously thin, that ours were far from the first disappearances to plague that forest, a string of vanishings and grisly deaths stretching back decades, if not centuries. The more I learned, the more I began to suspect our ordeal had been part of a cycle of sacrifice and horror, as old as the land itself, that the wraith-like entity orchestrating the hunt from its decaying cabin was a shred of some ancient, primal evil, a malign intelligence woven into the very fabric of those shadow-haunted woods. Perhaps it fed on fear and suffering the way we feed on bread and water, needing periodic sacrifices to sate its unnatural hunger. Our intrusion into its domain had simply marked us as the most convenient prey, the easiest flesh to rend and bones to snap. These dark epiphanies brought me no peace, no closure. If anything, they only amplified the sense of cosmic helplessness, that we were but insignificant fleas caught in a web of eldritch forces beyond our comprehension. That the mundane world we clung to was a fragile illusion, a soap bubble begging to be popped by the claws lurking in the void. I might have lost myself entirely in that abyss of existential despair were it not for a phone call from Ryan on a bleak November evening, 6 months after we had escaped the forest. His voice was tight with barely suppressed excitement as he urged me to come over to his place immediately. He had something to show me, something that couldn't wait. Intrigued despite myself, I made the drive across town to his small apartment. He greeted me at the door with bloodshot eyes and a manic energy I had never seen from him before. "I found it," he kept muttering as he led me to his kitchen table. "I finally found it." Spread across the scratched formica was a mess of ancient-looking books and maps, most of them marked with the distinctive wear and must of used bookstores. But what immediately seized my attention was the sketch lying on top of the pile, a sketch of a symbol I had prayed to never see again. With a shaking finger, Ryan tapped the eldritch rune scrawled in faded ink. It was identical to the ones that had been etched in the hearth of that nightmarish cabin, the ones that had seemed to grant the wraith its power, the ones I had destroyed to banish it back into the abyss. Seeing it again sent a lance of ice down my spine. "I found it in this old book of regional folklore," Ryan explained, his words tumbling out in a caffeinated rush. "It's a warding sigil, a symbol used to bind and confine primal entities to certain places. The indigenous shamans would carve them to trap dark spirits they couldn't destroy outright." I leaned closer, studying the dense paragraphs of cramped text surrounding the sketch. "So those markings in the cabin, they were like a magical prison, keeping that thing locked in those woods?" Ryan nodded vigorously. "Exactly. But here's the important part." He stabbed a finger at a particular passage. "The wards have to be periodically renewed with blood sacrifice. The more powerful the entity, the more frequent the sacrifices need to be. If the rituals are abandoned—" He didn't need to finish the thought. A chill of understanding shivered through me. The wraith had said it had been gathering strength, waiting in that in-between place for its glorious hunt. What if our destruction of the wards hadn't just banished it, but freed it entirely? to carry its insatiable hunger for fear to other hunting grounds. Ryan must have read the dawning horror on my face. He looked at me with grim urgency in his eyes, a man who had stared into the same abyss of unthinkable possibilities. "If I'm interpreting this right," he said hoarsely, "then by breaking those sigils, we didn't bind that thing, we released it. And without the shamans to repair the wards and renew the rituals, there's nothing to stop it from spreading." The words fell like tombstones, heavy with unspeakable implications. In our desperation to survive, had we unleashed something far worse on the world? Was our ordeal in the forest merely the prelude to a wider web of nightmares? "We have to do something," Ryan continued. "Try to find a way to contain it again, or warn people, or I don't know. But we can't just ignore this. We've seen what it's capable of." I couldn't hold back a bark of bleak laughter. Warn them about what? A formless terror from beyond the veil of reality that hunts through fear itself? We'll sound like madmen. They'll lock us away. Tears of frustration welled in Ryan's bloodshot eyes. "I know how it sounds, but I can't just sit here knowing what I know, seeing those symbols every time I close my eyes. We're responsible for this, even if we never meant to be." The desperate urgency in his voice resonated with the guilt gnawing at my own soul. As much as I wanted to deny it, I knew he was right. In this fallen world of horrors and wonders, we alone understood the nature of the threat unbound. The burden fell on us to try to find a way to contain it before it could sink its ethereal claws into more innocent lives. "Okay," I said at last, a leaden resignation settling over me. "We'll do what we can, for Mike and Chris if nothing else. But we need to be smart about it, careful. We're flying blind here, and I'm not eager to become that thing's quarry again." And so began a quest as desperate as it was quixotic. Powered by grief, guilt, and grim resolve, Ryan and I spent countless sleepless nights huddled over arcane tomes and obscure websites, trying to unravel the keys to the rituals of binding. We tracked down every whisper of unnatural encounters and paranormal events, trying to map the Wraith's movements through the web of fear it spun. Were we hunting it, or was it simply luring us deeper into its labyrinth of shadows, drawing us into a new snare, a more expansive trap? I couldn't shake the skin-crawling intuition that every step we took was playing into some eldritch agenda we couldn't begin to fathom. But what other choice did we have? To bury our heads in the sand and wait for the malign ripples to spread, knowing the next pale faces on the missing posters could be our own doing. To wait for it to accrue enough power to fully manifest in our reality, to turn the whole world into its hunting ground. No, we had to try. For Mike and Chris. For the shamans who had given their blood and sanity to keep it bound. For all the future victims whose suffering might be laid at our feet if we did nothing. Maybe there was no containing such a primal force in the end. Maybe we were deluding ourselves to think two broken men could stand against the onslaught of an entity as old as fear. But if our time in those woods had taught us anything, it was that the only thing more unforgivable than standing against the abyss was surrendering to it. So we soldiered on, through the infested tunnels of the occult and the bleak pits of our own trauma, clinging to each other and to our battered shreds of sanity, a pair of hunters seeking to turn the tables on the ultimate predator. But always, always in the darkest pits of night, I couldn't escape the insidious fear that it was hunting us in turn, that our every effort to bind it was leading us deeper into its eternally patient snare, that in the end all our desperate struggles would be little more than the last futile thrashings of the prey before the inexorable snap of shadowed jaws. But what else is left in this fallen world than to rage against the dying of the light, to spit our defiance into the void, even as it swallows us whole? We had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. And in that eldritch gaze, we had no choice but to see the hunt through to its bitter end, or to become the ones hunted for the rest of our days. In our desperate quest to contain the primal evil unleashed from the forest, Ryan and I soon learned that the true nature of the hunting ground had shifted drastically. The Wraith's ethereal influence was no longer confined to those shadow-haunted woods. Tendrils of its fear-fed power had begun to seep into the very fabric of civilization, an invisible miasma coiling unseen through city streets and suburban cul-de-sacs. We first caught wind of it spread through a string of bizarre and unsettling incidents cropping up in the news. A rash of missing persons cases, all of them vanishing without a trace after raving to loved ones about being stalked by unseen predators. Accounts of strange mists creeping through public parks, leaving behind the mutilated carcasses of animals, and sometimes the odd blood-stained scrap of human clothing. An entire downtown block whose residents descended into a shared psychosis overnight, barricading themselves inside while screaming about the horrors clawing at their walls. To the general public and the authorities, these were unconnected tragedies, freak occurrences, and sad footnotes in the police blotter. But to those of us who had survived a glimpse behind the curtain, who knew to look for the pattern amid the static of strange events, the grim implications were all too clear. The wraith was insinuating itself into the cracks in the facade of the mundane, exploiting the fear and isolation that lurked in every human heart. Where once it had to lure prey into its forest domain to feed, now it could stalk and harvest us in our own backyards, glutting itself on a conveyor belt of terror. And with every atrocity it orchestrated, every nightmare it wove into the collective unconscious, it was only growing stronger, its presence seeping ever deeper into the marrow of our world. How long until that spectral invasion reached a tipping point, until our reality was little more than an extension of its eternally hungry shadow? This was the chilling theory that consumed our waking thoughts and haunted our restless nights, as Ryan and I hurled ourselves into the task of triangulating the wraith's movements and machinations through the web of human misery it spun. If we could just pinpoint the locus of its power, the nexus from which its malign influence radiated, perhaps we could find a way to blunt its advance, to excise its spoor from our collective psyche before the infection reached the terminal stage. But it was a task easier named than done. After all, how does one track a being that seems to exist more as a poisonous thought form than a physical entity, a creature of mist and fear and nightmare logic? We couldn't exactly punch its lair coordinates into Google Maps and come up with a handy address to stage our desperate exorcism. Instead, we were forced to trawl through the darkest recesses of the paranormal underground, sifting through a morass of rumor, speculation, and apocryphal lore for any scrap of data that might light our way. We pored over musty tomes of forbidden knowledge in university archives, scrolled through endless occult forums and conspiracy theory message boards, even tracked down old stories and oral histories from the indigenous peoples whose ancestors had first learned to fear the forest's eldritch hunger. Piece by piece, through caffeine-fueled bouts of bleary research and manic dot connecting, a pattern began to cohere from the static. Certain locations cropped up again and again in the litany of strange events, coordinates that traced the edges of an emergent shape. Separately, they were just unfortunate places where the veil between worlds seemed to wear thin, a shuttered mental asylum where a string of patient suicides defied explanation, a deconsecrated church where shadows gathered with eerie intent, a bridge notorious for the number of people compelled to leap from its spans. But taken together, plotted out on a map with threads of red yarn, they formed the rough outline of a very familiar symbol, the warding sigil whose destruction had unleashed the wraith in the first place. It was as if those points were acting as anchors for the entity, allowing it to project itself along the ley lines of fear that connected them, to turn the entire region into an extension of its original hunting grounds. With dawning horror, I traced my finger along the lines of the phantom sigil, the edges of a magical trap snapping into focus. There was still one point unaccounted for, one anchor required to complete the pattern and fully manifest the wraith's power in our world. And in a flash of grim certainty, I knew exactly where that final locus would be. The one place where the borders between realities had first been sundered, where the cycle of sacrifice and nightmare had been interrupted. The one place where we had personally paved the way for its intrusion into our lives. That goddamned cabin, the nexus of our trauma, the site of our first encounter with the piercing abyss of its gaze. Of course, the trap would snap shut there, the beast claiming its hunting grounds in full. I turned to Ryan, nausea and adrenaline rising in equal measure at the revelation. His haunted eyes met mine with the same leaden understanding, the same fatalistic acceptance. We both knew there was only one way this could play out, only one path left to us. We had to go back, to return to the source of our sundered innocence and make our stand, for good or ill. It wasn't a question of whether we could win in a world suddenly reordered by the impossible. Against a primal darkness that broke minds and devoured souls, that had turned reality itself into its stalking grounds, we had no illusions of victory. We who had been hunted, and in our struggles to survive had only opened the door to the abyss, could never truly be the hunters. No, for us, it had only ever been a question of how we could make our defeat mean something, what we could salvage from the ruins of our former lives, what we could deny the wraith to the very last. If we could lure it back to that rotting cabin, distract it just long enough to restore the sigils and bind it once more, perhaps we could spare others our fate, damn the widening gyre of its malice. We would be its sacrifice, the blood price required to seal the breach between worlds, a last futile act of defiance, to spit in its eye even as it consumed us. In a fallen world where meaning had bled out with the color, where the only truth left was the inexorable dread of the stalking shadow, maybe that was the best we broken hunters could hope for. So we made our preparations in grim silence, each of us reflecting on the little rituals and ablutions of a life we knew would soon be cut short. Phone calls to bewildered family members, telling them we loved them without the context that would make it a goodbye. Emails to old friends, making amends for petty rifts and remembering better days. Visiting the local animal shelter to give some faithful canines one last moment of human kindness and a belly rub for the road. And through it all, the journaling, the constant journaling. Pouring out our story onto every scrap of paper we could find, secreting it in hidden flash drives and remote servers, burying it deep in the archives of the occult underground. Because if we couldn't make it out with our lives, then maybe we could with our warning, our hard-won scraps of impossible truth. Maybe someday someone would stumble across our testaments and piece together the clues we had left behind, would see through the cracks in the world to the deeper darkness lurking beneath, and find a way to renew the rituals, to take up the vigil we had been forced to abandon. It was a slim hope, a desperate lifeline cast into an uncertain future, but it was all we had left to cling to. And so, with our affairs settled and our resolve hardened to a nihilistic edge, we gathered our warding supplies and our weapons, our canned food and our candles, and set off one last time for the forest that had claimed us, the place where our lives had first become a waking nightmare. Back to that hungry hollow, that gaping maw in the skin of the world, to make our last stand in the physical epicenter of its power. Back to that decaying cabin squatting like an obscene altar amid the creeping murk. Back to the belly of the beast, to meet our stalker, our destroyer, our dark twin, to become the sacrifice required to bind it, or to die spitting our last defiance into the void that gaped beneath its gaze. Back to the primal hunting ground, one last hunt to end all hunts, where the only uncertainty that remained was which of us would be the hunters, and which the hunted. But then, in a world gone mad, in a reality reordered by tooth and claw and the stalking shadow, did that distinction even matter anymore? All that was left was the chase, the pounding heart, the blood-copper taste of terror. All that was left was the hunt. Our return to the forest where it had all begun was an exercise in grim déjà vu, a macabre reprisal of a journey we had taken in innocence and exited in nightmare. The same winding roads, the same weedy pull-off, the same overgrown trailhead that seemed to breathe with ominous intent. But if the physical geography was familiar, the psychic terrain we navigated was another matter entirely. Gone was the nervous camaraderie, the naive excitement of friends embarking on an adventure. In its place was a grim, haunted silence, the palpable dread of two men walking knowingly to their own execution. The weight of our knowledge of the impossible truths we had gleaned hung over us like a shroud. We weren't just venturing into a manifestation of primal evil. We were returning to the epicenter of a trauma that had shattered our understanding of the world, that had imprinted itself on our psyches like a brand. Every step we took was an act of will, a denial of the instinct to flee and never look back. As we hiked deeper into the gloom of the forest, the signs of the wraith's growing power soon became apparent. Scorch marks and eldritch sigils marred the bark of the trees, pulsing with that nauseating purple light. Shadows gathered with new intensity, their edges shimmering and reforming in ways that defied natural geometry. And always, always that sense of being watched, of being marked by a predator's gaze, a pressure that grew into a physical ache behind the eyes. We moved through that aura of menace like divers descending into the crushing black of an oceanic trench, every fiber of our being screaming at us to turn back. But grimly, stubbornly, we pressed onwards to our goal, that dilapidated cabin crouching in a hollow like a ravenous beast, its rotting maw agape. Our plan, if it could be called that, was a study in desperation. We would use our own fear, our own trauma, as bait for the wraith, a beacon of psychic anguish to draw it to us. Once it took that bait, once it manifested in a form we could grapple with, we would distract it just long enough to reconstruct the warding sigils on the cabin's hearth. Seal it back in its decaying prison through the spilling of our own blood, the severing of the connection forged by its claws, a plan that demanded our suffering, that traded on our brokenness, a plan that required us to run headlong into the primal terror we had spent the last year running from. But then, that had always been the devil's bargain, hadn't it? To use the wraith's own weapons against it, to embrace the monstrousness it had awoken within us. We had no illusions of noble sacrifice, of a storybook ending. We who had set it free through our own heedless destruction could never play the spotless heroes. No, we were doing this for purely selfish reasons, to silence the screaming in our own minds, to cauterize the claw wounds on our souls, to have some agency in an end we knew was inescapable. And if by some unlikely grace we managed to bind the thing again, to spare others our fate, so be it. But that was secondary to the true goal, unspoken but bone-certain, to face the beast on our own terms, to meet its annihilating gaze with one last defiant howl, to be the sacrifice instead of the sacrificed. With those thoughts at once grandiose and unbearably bleak, we approached the black mouth of the cabin. The air around it shimmered like a heat haze, the veil between worlds stretched to a moaning thinness. I could feel the wraith's presence like a physical pressure, a smothering psychic weight bearing down on us. It knew we were here. It had been waiting. "No turning back now," Ryan said, his voice a dry rasp. He clutched the ritual knife in a white-knuckled grip, his other hand shaking around the can of spray paint we would use to reconstruct the sigils. Into the belly of the beast. I nodded grimly, my own fear a live current under my skin. Let's finish this, one way or another. Together, moving as one, we stepped across the threshold and into the Stygian depths of the cabin, into the nightmare that had been waiting, patient zero of an infection that had contaminated the world, into the gaping maw of a reality reordered by shadows. What happened in that lightless lair is a fever dream, a delirium of impressions more than a coherent narrative. Flashlight beams scything through a cloying murk, the skitter of claws on rotting wood, a stench like carrion and despair. The cabin writhing around us, unfolding like some obscene origami, as if we had stepped into the flexing organs of a vast and ancient beast. And there, in the charred ruin of the hearth, a swirling vortex of absolute darkness, a hole in the world that pulsed like an infected wound. The wraith uncoiling itself from that lightless pit, a shape of empty shadow and malevolent flame, of antlers and embers and teeth. Every nightmare made manifest, every childhood terror given form and awful purpose. We screamed then, the full-throated howls of the damned, our voices twining with the wraith's triumphant roar, a dissonant choir of agony and ecstasy. We charged, weapons raised, hurling our bodies and our sanity against the unassailable dark. To say we fought would be too grandiose. There was no heroic battle, no skillful dance of thrust and riposte, only flailing, shrieking desperation. Only the spastic death throes of prey cornered by a vastly superior predator. The wraith toyed with us, batted us aside with contemptuous ease, its laughter a serrated blade across the mind. We were insects before a hurricane, sparrows before a wolf. Yet somehow, through luck or fate or sheer stubborn grit, we managed to hold its attention just long enough. Long enough for Ryan, broken and bleeding, to crawl to the hearth and begin spraying wavering sigils through his tears. Long enough for me to slice open my own palm and smear my blood on those eldritch marks in unholy communion. The wraith, realizing our intent, howled in fury, A force like a sledgehammer slammed into my chest, flinging me across the room to crumple against the wall. Through the gray haze of agony, I watched Ryan work, teeth gritted, hand shaking as he connected the lines of our salvation and our damnation. He was chanting now, ancient words torn from a blackened throat. The warding runes began to glow, fitfully at first, then with a steadier pulse. The wraith screeched and thrashed, its form distorting, fraying at the edges. Shadows lashed the walls, clawing for escape, finding only the unyielding geometry of the sigils. The energies they channeled lanced through the cabin, a building pressure, a trap snapping inexorably shut. In that eternal splintered moment, my eyes met the wraiths across the maelstrom. Sentient darkness and flickering flame, pitiless depths that pulled at the soul. A gaze that knew me, that saw all the fault lines and hollow places in my being, every secret flinch and festering guilt. It was my annihilation, my apotheosis, the event horizon of my sanity. I saw in that timeless moment the truth of our symbiosis, our awful communion, that without our fear it would starve, that its existence depended on our belief, our imagination, that in the end the only thing that could nourish a god of terror was our own terror, and in that understanding was a strange, bitter species of peace. For if we, in our brokenness, were the authors of its power, we could also be the agents of its binding. We were writing the terms of our own salvation, authoring our own deliverance through this ritual of confrontation and catharsis. We couldn't unsee the abyss, unknow the truth of the stalking shadow, but in the crucible of this moment we could transform our trauma, our damage, into the bars of a cage. We could make our nightmare the warden of our sanity, the jailer of our monster. That was the secret, the hidden key, to embrace our fear, to own it, to forge it into a chain for the beast, to make our minds a prison it could never escape because we would never escape it, to bind it in the only cell strong enough to hold a god, the dungeon of our shattered psyches. And so, in that infinite, fractured instant, I poured everything into the connection, the current of battle and nightmare, every memory of that first hellish night, every hour spent jumping at shadows, every relationships destroyed by my brittle paranoia, all the ways the wraith had made me, unmade me, reshaped me. It howled as I fed our bond, glowed with the heat of our history. I was venom and salvation, victory and defeat, the shackle and the shackled. The wraith's annihilation and its apotheosis, dream and dreamer, monster and mirror. The warding sigils blazed with cold fire, a glacial light. The air shimmered, convulsed with unleashed potential, and then, with a sound like reality tearing, the wraith folded in on itself, was pulled shrieking into the vortex of its prison. The cabin shuddered, groaned like a sinking ship, and then fell still. A silence, as deep and still as an open grave, as profound as the space between stars. And Ryan and I, still living, still breathing, knelt in the dust and the ruin, weeping, laughing, howling to the uncaring dark, the bladder-voiding rush of still being alive overwhelming all else. We had done it. Won and lost, saved and damned ourselves, written the final chapter of our story in blood and fire and madness. We crawled out of that black pit on our hands and knees, left it to the forest and the forces we had bound within it, dragged ourselves back to a world we no longer recognized, a reality forever fractured by the cracks of our knowing. In the days and years to come, we would pick up the pieces, stitch them together into a quilt of scar tissue and gallows humor. We would tell our story in fits and fragments, in carefully anonymized screeds on occult message boards and whispered confessions in shadowed bars. We would learn to live with the knotted thing behind our hearts, to use it as a hidden compass. We would be the watchers on the wall, the guardians of thresholds and tellers of bleak truths. We would forever ring the edges of the abyss, marked by it, part of it, wardens of the unquiet dark. The wraith was not dead, not gone, only dreaming in the cage of our minds, the prison of our devotion. We could feel it there, coiled and waiting, a slumbering viper in the deep places of our souls. One day we knew the sigils would fade, the bars would bend, the beast would wake, but until then we would hold the line, stand our watch on the borderlands of a world that would never know how close it had come to the final nightfall. We would laugh and drink and love, tell our tales to any who would listen, the secret keepers, the shepherds of the black. And when the stars were right, when the abyss yawned wide, we would be there to meet it, broken and damned, bound by blood and darkness. Hunters and hunted, saviors and sacrifices. We had written our own legend, etched it in nightmares and scar tissue. We had discovered the truth of the stalking shadow, the price and power of the primal dark. We had become, gods help us, the keepers of the hunger that waits. My name is Alex Walker, and I'm 32 years old. I live in a small apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, barely scraping by on my meager salary as a park ranger. I took this job out of desperation a few years ago when I couldn't find any other work. The pay is low and the hours are long, but I do love being out in nature. Hiking and camping are my passions. I've worked as a ranger in state and national parks across the country, Isle Royale in Michigan, Crater Lake in Oregon, the Allegheny Forest in Pennsylvania, the Apostle Islands in Wisconsin. But my current post in the remote wilderness of Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina is by far the most challenging. Strange things have been happening lately. Hikers vanishing without a trace, eerie sounds echoing through the woods at night, and a permeating sense of being watched. The other rangers and I are on high alert, but we're understaffed and ill-equipped to deal with whatever is going on. Last night I had a terrifying experience. I was alone in my watchtower, gazing out at the moonlit trees, when I saw a shadowy figure darting through the underbrush. It moved impossibly fast, more animal than human. I tried to follow it with my binoculars, but it disappeared into the darkness. A shiver ran down my spine. We'd been getting reports from campers about strange sightings in the woods, ghostly apparitions, dark shapes stalking between the pines, glowing eyes peering out from the shadows. The old-timers in the nearby town spoke of ancient legends, evil spirits that roamed the forest seeking lost souls to drag into the depths. I'd always dismissed such tales as superstitious folklore, until now. Something is out there in those woods, something unnatural. I can feel it in my bones. It's my job to keep the park visitors safe, but how can I protect them from an unknown threat? I radioed the central office requesting backup and search parties to find the missing hikers, but so far my calls have gone unanswered. We're on our own out here, just me, a few other rangers, and the eerie presence lurking in the wilderness waiting to strike. I've started keeping a journal to document the strange occurrences in case something happens to me. If you're reading this now, it means I never made it back out of this forest alive. Please tell my story so others know the truth. There's an evil older than these ancient woods, and it's hungry for human souls. It started with the disappearances. At first, it was just one or two hikers who failed to return from their backcountry trips. Concerning, but sadly not uncommon in a rugged wilderness like Nantahala. Experienced outdoorsmen can easily fall victim to the elements, getting lost, injuring themselves, falling into ravines. We mounted search parties but found no traces. Then more and more people began to vanish. Whole groups gone without a trace. Abandoned campsites with tents and gear still in place, untouched, like they'd been abducted straight out of their sleeping bags. Panic slowly crept over the park staff. I tried to keep morale up, but I could see the fear in my colleagues' eyes. We all knew something unnatural was happening. I pored over old books and maps in the park archives, searching for any scrap of information. Buried in the dusty pages, I found whispered tales of dark forces in the woods, predating even the Cherokee who once roamed this land. Ancient, malevolent entities that demanded sacrifice and subsisted on human suffering. Was it possible such myths had a kernel of truth? I interviewed some old hunters at the Cedar Log Tavern in the nearest outpost of civilization, 50 miles from the park borders. They spoke of hearing chilling shrieks and howls echoing through the night forest, of finding mutilated deer carcasses dangling in trees, nearly drained of blood. The oldest man leaned across the table, his hoarse whisper barely audible over the honky-tonk music. The hungry ones are back, just like 50 years ago when campers were found ripped to pieces. That night, I dreamed of twisted, emaciated figures emerging from the mist between the trees, their bodies contorted like gnarled roots, their eyes black pits. I woke in a cold sweat as an inhuman wail pierced the night outside my cabin window. Coyotes, I told myself. But coyotes never sounded so tortured, so hungry. A young couple failed to check in the next morning after camping near Lucifer Falls. Another search, another dead end. Surveying the abandoned tent, I noticed large swaths of fallen pine needles violently kicked up, like there had been a ferocious struggle. On a broken fir bough nearby, a single scrap of plaid flannel snagged and fluttering in the breeze. It was stained with something rust-colored that flaked beneath my fingernail. My heart turned to black ice. I'm patrolling the park trails from dawn till dusk now, my senses on high alert, jumping at every snapped twig and bird call. I've started carrying my loaded hunting rifle, even though it's against protocol. The forest seems to close in around me, the shadows between pines deepening even at noon. I know I'm being stalked by an evil that's always just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. The darkest day came with the mist. I awoke to find the world outside my cabin window erased, replaced by a thick silver fog that swallowed all sound and light. Uneasily, I made my way to park headquarters to check in with the superintendent and other rangers, but the outpost stood deserted, chairs knocked over, papers scattered, no vehicles in the parking lot, no tracks in the muddy gravel besides my own. Fighting rising panic, I tried the radio. Only harsh static answered, all the Park Service channels dead air. I was alone in a silent sea of fog and trees, the weight of solitude crushing my chest. With an ominous sense of déjà vu, I recalled my night terrors about shambling, hungry shapes in the mist. The hair on my nape prickled. I spent hours fruitlessly searching for any sign of my coworkers or campers throughout the shrouded forest, calling until my voice went hoarse. Nothing but the echo of my own desperation amid the dripping leaves. Cold dread settled in my marrow with the realization that whatever malevolent force stalked this wilderness had made its move, a full-scale assault. When the mist began to dissipate that evening, I spotted smoke rising above the hills in the direction of a backcountry trail shelter. The distinctive black plume of burning hardwood and evergreen sap. My surge of hope sank to horror as I approached the source. The trail shelter had been reduced to a pile of charred, smoldering timber. It looked like it had been blasted apart from within. Viscous splatters of crimson crisscrossed the splintered logs. Bits of red pulp and shredded fabric littered the leaf mold. The noxious stench of burned flesh mingled with scorched pine sap, making me gag. I didn't have to see bodies to know the gruesome demise met by the shelter's occupants. A faint, gurgling moan made me spin around, reaching for my rifle. There between two pines, a figure crouched over the prone form of a man in a ranger uniform, its spindly hands working in jerky motions. In the dying light, I glimpsed ash-gray skin, skeletal limbs, a head like a grotesque gourd. The thing whipped around to face me, black eyes glittering like beetle shells above a lamprey mouth lined with needle teeth. Blood dripped from its chin. I fired on pure instinct. The bullet punctured the entity's chest with a wet thud, sending it staggering back into the shadows. But it did not fall. To my horror, the dark hole in its emaciated sternum sealed shut like a zipper, edges of fetid gray flesh knitting together. A wheezing rattle issued from its throat, building to an enraged shriek that sent every bird erupting from the treetops in a cacophony of alarm calls. Then it charged me, moving with a jerky marionette gait almost too fast to track. In sheer panic, I turned and ran, sprinting wildly through the trees as the creature's shrieks and loping footfalls echoed behind me. Branches slapped my face and snagged my uniform. My heart felt like it would explode. Ahead through the blue twilight, I spotted a 2-track dirt road, one of the backcountry access routes. An olive-green Park Service Jeep sat parked in the center, driver's door ajar. I threw myself into the vehicle, fumbling the key into the ignition with shaking hands as the shrieks grew closer. The engine roared to life. In the rearview mirror, I glimpsed the entity burst from the tree line onto the road behind me in a flurry of dead leaves, galloping after the vehicle on all fours like a ravenous ape. I slammed the accelerator, tires spitting gravel and pine needles. The thing kept pace for a few yards, its banshee screams ripping the dusk before falling away in the dust. I didn't dare stop until I reached the deserted park headquarters, drenched in icy sweat, gasping. With dread, I realized the horrific truth. One of the ancient hungry ones from folklore had risen from its long sleep, and its ravenous brethren would soon follow. The primal evil that haunted this forest was real, and now it knew I was here, fighting it. There would be no help or backup. Rifle clutched in my shaking hands, I barricaded myself in the HQ to wait out the night, jumping at every creak of timber, while a chorus of distant, unholy howls rose with the moon beyond the pines. I couldn't save the others. The only thing left to do was to try to survive and bear witness, to warn the world of the hungry dark before it could spread, if it wasn't already too late. I barely slept that night, shotgun across my knees, jumping at every creak and groan of the old ranger station. The hungry ones howled in the darkness beyond the walls, an unspeakable hunger in their alien voices. In the gray pre-dawn, I scoured the cabinets and lockers, gathering supplies. Extra ammunition, flare gun, first aid kit, some MREs, anything that might help me survive against the horrors lurking in the forest. With the sun, I emerged into an eerily silent park. No birdsong, no chatter of squirrels or chipmunks, just the crunch of my boots on gravel and the hammering of my heart. At the vehicle depot, I found most of the Jeeps torn open like tin cans, seats shredded, glass and metal strewn across oil-stained concrete. A few drops of blood spattered the ground. I salvaged what I could and sped off in the last working SUV. I drove the winding park roads for hours, searching for any park staff or visitors, but the campgrounds and cabins stood deserted, many ransacked. Backpacks spilling clothes, collapsed and slashed tents, blackened fire pits beside dented cookware. At the Cedar Creek backcountry site, I found only a single hiking boot, the foot still inside, gnawed to a bloody stump at the ankle. Fighting nausea, I realized the hungry ones had free rein over the entire park, and likely had already glutted themselves on dozens of victims. How long had their dark influence spread unchecked while I hid like a coward? In the Jeep's glove box, amid crumpled maps and candy wrappers, I found a leather-bound journal. It belonged to the park's historian, Evelyn. The last entry, dated a week ago, described her research into the area's folklore and a 19th century fur trapper's account of a wild man that stalked him through these woods, its eyes black as coal and hungry as winter. A guttural cry in the trees shattered my focus. I looked up to see a gaunt figure drop from a pine bough onto the Jeep's hood, a twisted parody of a man, gray skin stretched over protruding ribs and scapulae, its skull elongated like it had been crushed in a vice. It scrabbled at the glass with cracked, blackened nails, leaving oily smears. I fired the shotgun through the windshield, pulverizing the creature's chest in a burst of glass and gore. To my horror, it continued to writhe and shriek, dark blood oozing from the gaping wound. Its torso pulsed as things pushed out from within the cavity, a repulsive mass of snaking entrails and writhing centipedes. Revulsed, I threw the Jeep into reverse, sending the abomination tumbling to the dirt. In the mirror, I watched its ruptured carcass pull itself up with jerky, unnatural movements and lope into the underbrush. I sped away, Evelyn's journal and a singular thought clutched tight. If I couldn't stop these nightmares, the hungry ones would soon spread their corruption beyond the park's borders, an insatiable plague loosed upon the world. Leafing through Evelyn's journal, I began to piece together the dark history buried in this forest. The fur trapper's terrified account was just the start. In the 1920s, a WPA crew building park roads vanished without a trace. Decades later, a Boy Scout troop turned up dead at their campground, mutilated. The wild man sightings continued, a hiker in the 60s raving about a walking shadow that dragged his friend away into the night. The attacks seemed to surge every 30, 40 years when the hungry ones would rise like cicadas to feed, then hibernate, dead but dreaming. Evelyn theorized the entities had a source, a heart of darkness they spawned from. An old mining map showed a strange blank space deep in the park's interior, unlabeled, where she believed a cave system might hide some macabre secrets. But before I could ponder that further, a barrage of muddy thuds and shrieks bombarded the Jeep from all sides. Bony silhouettes darted between the roadside pines, moving to cut me off. I gunned the engine, tires spitting dirt and pine needles. In the mirror, dozens of contorted shapes boiled out of the forest behind me, scrambling and bounding in my wake. Their guttural howls turned my stomach to ice. I had to get off the road. It was too easy for them to surround me. I turned down a narrow spur track into the west quarter of the park, bouncing over ruts and sending saplings scraping the undercarriage. My knuckles ached from gripping the steering wheel. The trail dead-ended at a ranger watchtower. I leapt from the Jeep and scrambled up the rickety stairs. The tower's plywood shelter was barely 4 feet square, a cramped cube with screen window slits on each wall. I barricaded the trapdoor with my pack and extra MRE rations, just as the first of the creatures burst from the tree line. They came in a ravenous wave of writhing limbs and gnashing teeth, hurling themselves at the tower's base. It shuddered under their impact. Pallid hands scrabbled at the support posts. Malformed skulls gnashed and clacked, splintering wood. The air filled with their gibbering and my stuttering breath. I emptied my shotgun into the mass, the muzzle flash painting freeze frames of hellish faces and ruptured bodies that refused to die. Claws gouged the floor inches from my feet. I stabbed and kicked, my boots finding spongy flesh and brittle bonework that reknit before my eyes. The tower's support splintered, the platform tilted precariously. In desperation, I fired a flare straight up into the night sky. The red trail sizzled heavenward for an eternal instant before bursting into a miniature sun, bathing the canopy crimson and throwing the horde below into stark relief, all jutting ribs and gaping mouths. To my shock, the creatures recoiled from the searing brightness with shrieks of pain, shielding their cavernous eye sockets. They scattered to the shadows, leaving a few withered husks smoldering on the forest floor. Panting, I realized what I'd discovered. The hungry ones feared the light. Perhaps that's why they hibernated in lightless caves for decades between feedings. Fierce hope kindled in my chest, warring with exhaustion. If I could just hold out until dawn. But true night was still hours away, and I had only 3 flares left. The creature's bulbous eyes glinted from the underbrush, patient and ravenous. My gaze fell on the Jeep, on its glove box stuffed with crumpled maps, on the Forest Service road snaking into the blank space at the heart of the park, where no trails went. I knew what I had to do. I had to take the battle to the hungry ones' lair, face the source of their evil. It was time for this nightmare to end one way or another. Evelyn had given her life to find the truth. Now it was up to me to ensure her sacrifice wasn't in vain, and that the world would never fall victim to the hungry dark waiting in these woods. I leapt from the watchtower and sprinted for the Jeep, flare gun gripped tight. The hungry ones surged from the shadows in my wake, their grasping claws snatching at my heels. I vaulted into the driver's seat and slammed the door just as a gnarled fist punctured the window, showering me with cubes of safety glass. Shoving the clutch to the floor, I crashed through the creature's ranks, the Jeep's bumpers and fenders crumpling against their desiccated bodies with sickening thuds. In the rearview mirror, I saw them pull their broken forms from the dirt and give chase, mouths agape, dead eyes alight with malice. I sped down the eroded mining track that snaked northeast through the forest, tires spinning on layers of mulched leaves and mud. According to Evelyn's maps, these trails led to a series of abandoned hematite mines from the 1800s and a cursed cave sacred to the hungry ones. With grim resignation, I knew I had to find their foul grotto and destroy it, or die trying. There could be no other end. The road gradually deteriorated into sluices of scree and sapling scrub. Beyond the Jeep's bloodied headlights, the inky tree line crowded close. Things moved in the roadside bracken, darting shadows and spidery limbs and unblinking eyes. They were pacing me, hurting me deeper into their dark heart. The Jeep bounced and shuddered up an incline of muddy ruts. I crested a ridge, and below, in the headlight beams, sprawled a lost mining settlement reclaimed by the elements, heaps of rotting timbers, collapsed stone chimneys, rusted machinery upthrust from the soil like the fossils of strange beasts. A few fungal phosphorescents glowed in the chinks and shadows. Nothing human had trod this blighted ground in a century. I stopped the Jeep at the camp's moldering fringe and stepped out into a silence thick as loam. No more howls or rustling in the underbrush, just the whisper of wind through desiccated boughs and the creak of my boots on ancient boards. The hungry ones had withdrawn for now, knowing their quarry could flee no further. With the finality of a tomb door closing, I entered the largest ramshackle structure, perhaps once the mining office. Yellowed documents and frontier detritus littered the floor, cracked lanterns, rusted pickaxes, scraps of vulcanized rubber. I searched the brittle papers by flickering flashlight, seeking any final scrap of information to guide me. In the rotted desk drawers, I found another leather-bound journal, this one nearly crumbling to the touch. The first page bore a single line in spidery script: Cyrus Blackwood, foreman, Nantahala Iron Mines, 1897. Heart-pounding, I turned the pages with shaking fingers. The final entry spoke of a great evil unearthed by the miners in a cave called Starve Hollow Gulch, of men gone missing in the lightless depths, of a tribal shaman's warnings to seal the tunnels with dynamite, lest the hungry ones wake ravenous from their ancient slumber. But the mining company, seeking profit, had refused. "The mountain bled black this morning," one passage read. Jonas emerged from the mine pale as milk glass, raving about how the shadows moved below, and skittering noises in the dark, and eyes, so many eyes in the void, hungry eyes. I flipped to the last page, my blood turned to ice melt. "The gulch has taken them all. It is too late. God forgive me." A map was tucked into the journal's back cover, sketched in faded pencil on cracked parchment. A twisting line led to a black X scrawled in the hills, an arrow pointing to two dread words: Starve Hollow. No sooner had I grasped this revelation than a bone-chilling howl went up from the forest, echoed by a chorus of others. A flurry of shadows streaked past the broken windows. They knew I'd uncovered their secrets, and now they were coming for me. I burst from the mining office into chaos. The hungry ones boiled out of the night woods, pouring between the skeletal buildings, jerky gait belying their preternatural speed. The closest ones bunched and leapt from the camp's perimeter, mummified faces contorted with glee. I fired a flare into their midst, the harsh magnesium glare throwing back the tide of grasping limbs an instant before they reached me. Smoldering, they shrank from the crimson starbursts, keening, but more were coming, dozens, their malformed silhouettes clogging the gaps between fungus-riddled beams. I sprinted for the jeep, pulse a war drum in my ears. Glancing at the map, I wrenched the wheel hard toward a gap in the trees, tires spinning on carpet of moldy leaves and wood chips. A steep track, gulched with erosion scars, climbed into the hills northeast toward the X marking the mine. Broken scenery strobed past the cracked windshield, deadfalls of hemlock and spruce, banks of massive ferns, jutting outcroppings of dark glistening stone. Mist threaded the high boughs, obscuring the sickle moon. Spindly shapes scuttled in the rearview mirror's edges, pacing me, yellow eyes like penlights in the gloom. The jeep bounced and shuddered over ever-worsening terrain. The transmission grinding in my ears mingled with their skittering and rustling behind. My knuckles were bloodless against the steering wheel. There could be no thoughts but to reach the gulch before they overwhelmed me. At last, the track reached a small shelf in the mountain's flank and ended at a head-high hole in a cliff face of obsidian schist, hideously organic in its dimensions, like a petrified maw. A few rotting beams framed the entrance, a cairn of bones heaped to one side. The hungry ones had savaged any creature foolish enough to seek shelter in their den. I pulled to a stop, grabbed my rifle and pack, and leapt from the jeep. The instant my boots hit soil, a tide of howling bodies burst from the trees, charging. I planted my feet, took aim at the closest one, and fired. The slug blew a hole through its skull the size of a rotten apple, but the creature barely slowed, ragdoll arms swinging. I turned to flee into the mine, but the hungry ones were too fast. 3 of them threw themselves on my back, cold fingers sinking into my scalp and neck, ancient nails drawing blood. We fell together across the bone pile in a writhing mass of torn uniforms and leprous flesh. I groped desperately for the flare gun, for a rock, a rusted pickaxe, anything. My hand closed on something rounded, half buried in the bones, ridged like a pine cone. I swung it up in an arc, bashing the creature, trying to gouge out my eyes. There was a brittle crunch and it fell away, black blood gushing from a staved-in temple. In a blink I realized what I'd grabbed. A human skull, pitted and stained with rich earth. I staggered upright, wielding it like a macabre cudgel. Crazed strength flowed through me, the madness of survival. The hungry ones swarmed, and I laid into them, pulping heads, smashing limb from limb, a savage roar in my throat. But there were too many, an endless stream of horrors. For every one I bludgeoned into the mud, 3 more took its place, lacerating my face and arms, jagged teeth gnashing for an artery. I screamed and kicked and raged, but it was no use. They bore me down, a mass of icy flesh pinning me in the churned soil and bones. Clawed fingers found my throat, my eyes, black spots swimming across my vision, the pulse in my skull a dying ember. This was the end then, the fate of all those I'd failed to save. I would be rendered and devoured, my tattered remnants left to molder at the entrance of their vile gulch, just one more forgotten victim. With my last fading thought, I raised my head and sank my teeth into the fetid wrist throttling me, biting until I tasted ash and spoiled meat. The creature reared back, screeching, and in that infinitesimal instant of freedom I flung myself toward the mine entrance, a final spasm of defiance. I hit the gravelly floor of the tunnel in a limp roll and scrambled deeper into the inky maw on all fours, gravel and stony shards cutting my palms. Behind me, the hungry ones seethed at the threshold, their luminous eyes and nails floating in the blackness, but they did not follow. Some invisible barrier seemed to hold them at bay, repelling them like matched magnets. They massed there, just outside the shaft, all sinewy arms and distended jaws and eyes, a wall of pale malevolent stars throbbing with ancient hunger. And then realization crashed through my foggy brain like a tank of icy water. The hungry ones could not enter the mine, not without a human to guide them into the abyss where they were spawned eons ago. That's why they had chased me here, herded me to this nightmarish door. I was to be their key, their vessel to unleash their charnel foulness on the world again. Despair pressed me to the cold stone, heavy as a yoke of iron and just as unyielding. Hot tears spilled down my ravaged cheeks. I couldn't go back, but to go forward into the gullet of their lair was just as sure a death. There had never been any hope of escape. They had been playing me for a fool this entire time. In the distance behind the seething horror at the mouth of the tunnel, a gray pre-dawn glow limned the mist-shrouded treetops. The night was ending, but my long final night was just beginning. There was nowhere to go but down, into the black heart of the mountain, to face the progenitor of all my battles and fears. I stood on quaking legs, drawing my last threads of courage around me like a tattered cloak. The hungry ones crouched in the tunnel mouth, a phalanx of shadowed limbs and teeth in unholy anticipation, waiting for me to lead them into the primordial womb that had disgorged them upon the world again and again over the eons, waiting for access to their queen. With leaden feet, rifle clutched before me like an amulet, I started into the mine's black gullet, flare gun a comforting weight against my hip. The tunnel's strange geology swallowed the pre-dawn light after a dozen paces, and I clicked on my flashlight. The bobbing orb illuminated close-pressing walls of rippled obsidian, glinting like black ice. Behind me I heard the hungry ones surge forward into the shaft, their long-denied homecoming a tide of scraping claws and gnashing teeth and guttural snarls. They dogged my stumbling steps, pacing me, cruel eyes boring into my back with palpable weight. One reached out to stroke my neck with a palsied hand, glee and hunger pulsing in its caress. The tunnel wound down in serpentine coils, the floor alternately natural shale and rotted wooden slats. A foul miasma hung in the air, ripe with the musk of centuries' undisturbed loam and ancient decay. The walls grew damp, beaded with an oily sheen. Puddles in the uneven floor held floating clouds of luminescent spores, eldritch will-o'-wisps. Time lost all meaning in that abyssal maw. I wandered in the press of dripping stone and Venus roots and grasping fungal blooms for an eternity, each bend in the passage revealing only more of the same black nightmare. The skittering of my unnatural entourage receded to a background drone, though I could feel the heat of their covetous gazes. At last the tunnel opened into a vast sunken vault, the space shot through with curtains of phosphorescent mushrooms and ropes of calcite. A few rotting wooden structures dotted the cavern's edges, collapsed lift scaffolds, a few stacks of crumbling barrels, and at the chamber's nadir, a roiling black lake, its surface pocked with skeletal shapes. I crept to the edge of the subterranean mirror and shone my light into the icy depths. Suspended in the peaty water like macabre ornaments were dozens of human remains in varying states of decay, the missing hikers, my fellow rangers, their open mouths frozen in eternal screams. As I watched, a few sank into the black murk, while others rose as if on puppet strings to take their place. And I knew then the terrible truth. This was how the hungry ones replenished their ranks after each cyclical culling. The icy waters preserved their fleshy shells, while the pit of roots, as the tribal legends called it, nourished the evil animating them from below. A self-sustaining colony of darkness defiling the land's forgotten corner. As the revelation crashed over me, I felt my strength give out at last. I couldn't fight this, couldn't overcome a malignance that had festered in the depths for untold centuries before humanity's first footprints in the loam. All my efforts had been futile. Evil would always grow again in the cracks, the shadows, the blind spaces beneath the world. I sank to my knees at the pit's edge, watching the bobbing husks of those I'd failed. The hungry ones fanned out around me, a susurrating, gleeful mass, waiting for me to surrender myself to the black water, to join my friends in their numb, blind servitude, waiting to be loosed upon the world in a dark tide by the lifting of the last human obstacle. In my despair, my gaze fell on the rotting timbers at the cavern's fringe, and Evelyn's final words echoed in my exhausted brain. The shaman urged us to seal the tunnels with dynamite, lest they wake ravenous. And like a lightning strike, desperate purpose galvanized my nerves, sent power surging back into my drained limbs. Seal the tunnels. I still had one card left to play, a final sheaf to lay upon this dark altar. I lunged for the nearest stack of decaying barrels, the hungry ones scattering in surprise. A few bore faded labels in archaic script: danger, explosives. Weeping with mad hope, I ripped the cap from my flare gun and rammed the phosphorus tip into the wood's soft rot, crimson flame blooming. As the conflagration spread, I dashed to the next stack and repeated the process, trails of sparks chasing me. The creatures howled in rage and consternation, their unified purpose shattering. Some surged for me in a chittering wave, while others milled in confusion. I ran along the pit's perimeter, touching the torch to every moldy crate and barrel, darting from gnarled hands and snapping teeth. Flames billowed and coiled through the chamber, sucking the oxygen to a stifling miasma. At last I turned and sprinted back up the mine shaft, the inferno roaring behind me, the acrid bite of ancient chemicals filling my lungs. The hungry ones shrieked and gibbered in my wake, engulfed in clouds of spitting embers. I felt claws snag my shirt, my hair, but I pushed on, the promise of the nearing dawn a siren song. I burst from the tunnel mouth into the gray forest a moment before the world ended. With an earth-shattering roar, the mountain bucked and heaved, fire and smoke erupting from the high crags. The cliffs crumpled inward like rotted cloth, burying the accursed gulch beneath 1,000,000 tons of rubble. Trees snapped and were hurled like javelins, and I was flung a dozen yards by the blast wave into a cushion of fern and humus. For a long moment I lay stunned on my back, watching ashes and embers spiral across the pre-dawn sky like macabre snow. The echoes of the explosion rang in my bruised skull. Slowly, shakily, I sat up, marveling at my survival. For a long moment I lay stunned on my back, watching ashes and embers spiral across the pre-dawn sky like macabre snow. The echoes of the explosion rang in my bruised skull. Slowly, shakily, I sat up, marveling at my survival. The hungry ones were gone, consumed by the cave-in or banished back to whatever primordial maw had first belched them upon the world. The land's wound would scab over and heal, its fell secrets buried deep, and eventually fade into half-remembered ghost stories once again. But I would never forget. I would carry the scars inside and out for the rest of my days. I limped through the hushed forest, stepping over shattered trunks and smoldering craters as the first fingers of dawn pried at the horizon. Overhead, a raven flew silently between the branches, regarding me with ebon eyes that held no hunger, no malice, just simple animal wisdom, nature's order restored. At last I emerged from the trees near the abandoned mining camp. Mist wreathed the fungus-riddled ruins, stirring with motes of ash. The air felt preternaturally still, cleansed, like after a thunderstorm. In the distance I spotted my battered jeep, still miraculously upright on the overgrown track. I clambered inside, fumbling for the radio. Static hissed from the speakers for a long, terrifying moment. Then a voice crackled to life, high and tense with worry, but achingly human. Nantahala Ranger Station to all field units, come in. Repeat. Ranger Station to Alex Walker, please respond. Over. I shut my eyes and exhaled a shuddering breath I felt like I'd been holding for days. They must have seen the explosion, must be sending rescue choppers even now. It was over. I was going home. I pressed the talk button, fighting back tears. Ranger Walker to base, I read you. Over. Alex, thank God. What's your 20? Are you all right? Over? I looked out through the cracked windshield at the brightening forest, battered but calm, tranquil. The marks of its battles would fade with time, even as mine never would. But for now, there was peace. The hungry ones were gone. I had won. Affirmative base, I said, shook up but intact. I'm at the old trailhead off Laurel Ridge Road. I've got quite a story to tell you. And a warning. Roger that, Alex. You can tell us everything soon. Bird is spinning up now, ETA your position 15 minutes. Just sit tight. You're going to be okay. Over. Copy base, sitting tight, Walker out. I set the radio down with numb fingers and leaned back against the headrest. The sun broke over the mountainside, washing the woods in gold. I closed my eyes and let its warmth play across my battered face. There would be debriefings, reports, endless questions I had no sane answers for. There would be nightmares, scars, and the knowledge that true evil lurked in the forgotten spaces of the world. But for now I let myself drift in the light. I had done my duty. I had given everything, and I had won. I had faced the hungry dark and lived to see the dawn. I was born and raised in the state of Maine, and I am of Penobscot and Abenaki descent. Growing up, I heard countless legends passed down through generations, tales that both fascinated and chilled me to the bone. But there was one story that always stood out, a warning that echoed in my mind long after the embers of the campfire had died out. It was the story of the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that haunted the forests, feeding on the flesh of the living. The story I'm about to tell you took place in the winter of 2019, when I was a 20-year-old college student in the town of Farmington, Maine. The campus was nestled along the banks of the Sandy River, a winding tributary that carved its way through the dense pine forests of the region. My friends and I would often venture down to the river's edge to escape the monotony of our studies, seeking solace in the crisp, clean air and the tranquil beauty of nature. One particularly cold evening, we decided to build a campfire by the river, hoping to ward off the biting chill that had settled over the land. I volunteered to gather kindling, making my way down to the laundry room to collect lint from the dryers. The snow had fallen heavily in the days prior, and I knew that most of the branches and twigs in the woods would be too damp to ignite easily. As I made my way back to the overlook where we had agreed to meet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The moment I stepped onto the frozen sand, a sense of unease washed over me, as though unseen eyes were watching my every move. I tried to brush off the feeling, attributing it to the eerie stillness of the winter night, but deep down, I knew better than to ignore my instincts. My friends had already begun to gather firewood, their laughter and chatter carrying across the river. I knelt down beside the ring of stones we had used countless times before, focusing my attention on the task at hand. As I worked to coax a flame from the lint, a sudden sound from the beach below caught my attention. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunched through the snow, echoing in the silence of the night. I glanced up, scanning the shoreline for any sign of movement. "Did you hear that?" I asked Ian, one of my closest friends, who was standing nearby. He looked at me, confusion etched across his face as he shook his head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone, that something dark and sinister lurked just beyond the reach of the firelight. And then the smell hit me. It was a sickly sweet odor, like the stench of rotting fruit mingled with the unmistakable scent of death. I recoiled, my stomach churning as I fought the urge to gag. I looked around at my friends, searching their faces for any indication that they had noticed the foul stench, but they seemed oblivious, lost in their own conversations. Just as I was about to speak, a voice called out my name, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. It was a guttural, inhuman sound, like the crackling of radio static mixed with the grating of metal against metal. In that moment, the pieces fell into place, and a wave of terror washed over me. The uneasy feeling of being watched, The heavy footsteps, the rotten stench, and now the voice calling my name. I had heard the stories of the Wendigo all my life, whispered warnings passed down from my grandfather, but until that moment I had never truly believed them. Now, faced with the undeniable truth, I felt my blood run cold. Instinctively, I pressed my face into the snow, squeezing my eyes shut as if by doing so, I could will the creature away. My heart raced in my chest, pounding against my ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. I could hear my friends' voices, distant and muffled, as they called out to me, but I dared not respond, fearing that any sound I made would draw the Wendigo's attention. The voice called out again, this time sounding eerily familiar, like an echo of my grandfather's warnings. But I knew better than to be fooled by its deception. The Wendigo was a master of mimicry, luring its victims with the voices of loved ones, only to consume them whole, leaving nothing but bones picked clean in the snow. I lay there, motionless, barely daring to breathe, as the footsteps drew closer, the stench of decay growing stronger with each passing second. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, and for a moment I was certain that the creature would find me, that it would sink its teeth into my flesh and devour me alive. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence vanished. The footsteps receded, fading into the distance, and the nauseating smell dissipated, carried away on the winter wind. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, my face buried in the snow, until the sound of my friends' voices finally broke through the fog of terror that had enveloped me. Slowly, cautiously, I sat up, keeping my eyes fixed on the ground as I scanned my surroundings. My friends had gathered around me, their faces etched with worry and confusion. They bombarded me with questions, asking if I was all right, what had happened. But I couldn't find the words to explain the horror I had just experienced. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me, and mumbled something about feeling ill. My friends, bless their hearts, didn't press the issue, instead offering to help me back to the dorms. We walked in silence, the only sound the crunching of our footsteps in the snow and the distant rushing of the river. Once we were safely inside, Ian pulled me aside, his eyes searching mine for answers. I hesitated, torn between the desire to confide in my friend and the fear that speaking of the Wendigo would somehow summon it back. In the end, I settled for a half-truth, telling him that I had felt like something was watching us, that I had been gripped by a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. Ian seemed to accept my explanation, though the concern never quite left his eyes. As we parted ways for the night, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt for not being fully honest with him. But deep down I knew that the truth was too terrifying, too unbelievable to share. It wasn't until years later, after I had moved away from Farmington, that I finally found the courage to speak of my encounter. Even then, I was careful to choose my confidants wisely, sharing my story only with those I trusted implicitly. To my surprise, none of my friends had heard or smelled anything unusual that night, leading me to believe that the Wendigo had singled me out, perhaps sensing the knowledge of its existence that lay dormant within me. In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself haunted by the memory of that night by the river. Sleep became a rare and precious commodity, as every time I closed my eyes, I was transported back to that frozen beach, the stench of death filling my nostrils and the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. I threw myself into my studies, desperate for any distraction from the gnawing fear that had taken root in my mind. But even the bustle of campus life and the demands of my coursework couldn't entirely banish the specter of the Wendigo. It lurked at the edges of my consciousness, a constant reminder of the darkness that lay hidden beneath the veneer of the world I thought I knew. As the winter gave way to spring and the snow began to melt from the banks of the sandy river, I found myself increasingly drawn back to the place where I had encountered the creature. It was as if some invisible force was pulling me, urging me to confront the terror that had gripped me that night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows began to lengthen, I made my way down to the river's edge, my heart pounding in my chest. The overlook was deserted, the ring of stones that had once housed our campfires now cold and lifeless. I stood there, staring out across the water, half expecting to hear the sound of heavy footsteps or catch a whiff of that sickening, sweet stench. But the only sound was the gentle rustling of the pines and the distant cry of a loon, echoing across the darkening sky. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the crisp, clean air, and for a moment I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Perhaps, I thought, the Wendigo had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of the fears and anxieties that had plagued me for so long. Just as I was about to turn back, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, sending a shower of pine needles cascading down around me. And then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible above the rustling of the branches, but unmistakable in its malevolence. "I see you," the voice hissed, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "You cannot escape me." I spun around, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, only the lengthening shadows and the growing darkness, pressing in around me like a physical force. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the damp sand, and then I was running, tearing through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my dorm room, slamming the door behind me and collapsing onto my bed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was then, as I lay there trembling, that I realized the truth. The Wendigo was no mere legend, no fairy tale monster conjured up to frighten children. It was real, and it had marked me as its prey. From that moment on, I lived in a constant state of fear, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for the sound of footsteps or the whisper of that terrible voice. I withdrew from my friends, spending more and more time alone in my room, poring over ancient texts and faded photographs, searching for any scrap of information that might help me understand the creature that stalked me. I learned that the Wendigo was a creature of hunger, a spirit that was never satisfied, always craving more. It was said to possess the bodies of those who succumbed to cannibalism, transforming them into gaunt, emaciated creatures with hearts of ice and an insatiable appetite for human flesh. But there were also stories of those who had managed to escape the Wendigo's clutches, who had found ways to ward off its evil influence. Some spoke of protective charms and amulets, others of sacred rituals and incantations passed down through generations. I became obsessed with these tales, spending long hours in the library, scouring dusty tomes and faded manuscripts for any scrap of knowledge that might aid me in my fight against the creature. I even reached out to my grandfather, hoping that he might have some insight into the legends of our people. But when I finally managed to get in touch with him, my grandfather's response was not what I had hoped for. He listened patiently as I recounted my tale, his weathered face growing more and more somber with each passing minute. When I had finished, he was silent for a long time, staring off into the distance as if seeing something that I could not. "You must be very careful," he said at last, his voice heavy with concern. "The Wendigo is a powerful spirit, and it has marked you as its own. It will not rest until it has claimed you, body and soul." I felt a chill run down my spine at his words, a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "But there must be something I can do," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "Some way to protect myself, to fight back against it." My grandfather shook his head sadly. "There is no fighting the Wendigo," he said. "Once it has chosen you, there is no escape. The only thing you can do is to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of it and pray that it loses interest in you." I left my grandfather's house feeling more lost and alone than ever before. The weight of his words hung heavy on my shoulders, a constant reminder of the fate that awaited me. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I knew that I could not give up. I had to keep searching, keep fighting, no matter the cost. And so I threw myself into my research with renewed fervor, spending every waking moment scouring the internet and the library for any scrap of information that might aid me in my fight. I talked to shamans and medicine men, seeking their wisdom and guidance, and I even began to experiment with some of the protective charms and amulets I had read about. But always, in the back of my mind, lurked the knowledge that the Wendigo was still out there, waiting for me. I could feel its presence, like a dark shadow hovering just beyond the edge of my vision, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before it made its move. As the weeks turned into months, and the seasons changed from spring to summer, I found myself growing more and more isolated from the world around me. My grades began to slip, and my professors started to express concern about my well-being. But I couldn't bring myself to care. All that mattered was staying one step ahead of the Wendigo, of finding some way to break free from its grip. I started to have vivid, terrifying dreams, nightmares in which I found myself lost in a dark, twisted forest, the trees closing in around me like grasping hands. In these dreams, I could hear the Wendigo's voice whispering to me from the shadows, promising me power and immortality if only I would submit to its will. But even in my dreams I fought back, clinging to the shreds of my sanity with all the strength I could muster. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew that I could not let the creature win. As the summer wore on, I started to notice strange things happening around me. Objects would go missing from my room, only to reappear in odd places, as if someone had been moving them while I slept. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to flicker and dance in the periphery of my vision. And then, one sweltering August night, I woke to the sound of something scratching at my window. At first I thought it was just a branch, blown by the wind. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the steady, rhythmic scraping, I felt a cold dread settle over me. I forced myself to sit up, my heart pounding in my ears, and peered out into the night. At first I saw nothing but the inky blackness of the forest, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the tree line. It was facing away from me, but even from this distance I could see the unnatural thinness of its limbs, the way its skin seemed to stretch tight over its bones. And then, slowly, it turned its head, and I saw its face. It was a nightmare made flesh, a twisted, distorted parody of a human being. Its eyes were sunken and hollow, glittering with a feral, hungry light, and its mouth was a gaping maw, filled with jagged, yellowed teeth. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, and all that came out was a strangled, choking sound. The creature took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, and I could see the hunger in its eyes, the raw, primal need that drove it. I fumbled for the charm I kept by my bedside, a small carved figure that my grandfather had given me, said to ward off evil spirits. But as my fingers closed around it, I felt a searing pain shoot through my hand, and I dropped it with a cry. The Wendigo was closer now, almost to the window, and I could smell the stench of decay that clung to it, the sickly sweet odor of rotting flesh. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable, for the feel of those jagged teeth sinking into my flesh. But the blow never came. Instead, I heard a sudden piercing shriek, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. My eyes flew open, and I saw the creature stumbling backward, clutching at its face as if in pain. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest, leaving me alone and trembling in the darkness. The next morning I woke to find the charm my grandfather had given me lying on the floor beside my bed. The wood scorched and blackened as if it had been held in a flame. I picked it up gingerly, turning it over in my hands, and saw that the carved symbols that had once adorned its surface were now barely visible, obscured by the charring. I knew then that I could not stay in Farmington any longer. The Wendigo had found me, and it would not rest until it had claimed me as its own. I had to get away, to put as much distance between myself and the creature as possible. I spent the next few days in a frenzy of activity, packing my belongings and making arrangements to transfer to a new school. I told no one of my plans, not even my closest friends, for fear that the Wendigo might somehow use them to get to me. On the day of my departure, I woke before dawn, my heart heavy with the knowledge of what I was leaving behind. I took one last look around my dorm room, at the posters on the walls and the books scattered across my desk, and felt a pang of regret for the life I was leaving behind. But I knew that I had no choice. The Wendigo had marked me, and I could not rest until I had found a way to break free from its grasp. And so, with a heavy heart, I shouldered my backpack and set out into the gray, misty morning. As I walked through the quiet streets of Farmington, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking threat, every rustling leaf a sign of the creature's presence. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting from side to side, my hand clutching the charm in my pocket like a lifeline. I made it to the bus station just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, watery light over the town. I bought a ticket for the first bus out of Farmington, not caring where it was going, only that it would take me far away from this place and the horrors that lurked within it. As I sat on the bus watching the familiar streets and buildings of Farmington recede into the distance, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I had escaped, at least for now. But even as I allowed myself to relax, I knew that my ordeal was far from over. The Wendigo was still out there, and it would not rest until it had found me again. The years that followed were a blur of constant movement and fear. I drifted from town to town, never staying in one place for more than a few months at a time. I took whatever jobs I could find, working as a dishwasher, a janitor, a factory worker, anything to keep myself moving, to stay one step ahead of the creature that haunted my dreams. But no matter how far I ran, I could never quite shake the feeling that the Wendigo was still out there, watching me from the shadows. I would catch glimpses of it in the corner of my eye, hear its whispers on the wind, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before it found me again. I tried to find solace in the old ways, in the traditions and beliefs of my ancestors. I sought out medicine men and shamans, hoping that they might have some insight into the creature that stalked me. But even they seemed powerless in the face of the Wendigo's hunger, and I soon lost faith in their ability to help me. And then, one cold, gray morning, I woke to find a message waiting for me. It was from my grandfather, a short, cryptic note scrawled on a piece of yellowed paper. "Come home," it said. "It is time." I knew what he meant, of course. He had always said that there would come a day when I would have to face the Wendigo, to confront the creature that had marked me as its own. And now it seemed that day had come. I made my way back to Maine, back to the forests and rivers of my childhood. I found my grandfather waiting for me at the edge of the woods, his face lined with age and wisdom. He led me deep into the forest, to a clearing where a fire burned low and smoky. There he told me the true story of the Wendigo, of the hunger that could never be sated, the emptiness that could never be filled. He spoke of the creature's origins, of the way it had once been human, before the hunger had taken hold and twisted it into something monstrous. And then he told me what I had to do. I had to face the Wendigo, to look into its eyes and see the emptiness there, the void that could never be filled. I had to let go of my fear, my anger, my despair, and find the strength within myself to resist its call. I listened to his words, my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew that he was right. I had been running from the Wendigo for too long, letting it consume me with fear and doubt. It was time to face it, to confront the darkness that lurked within me. And so, as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened, I stepped out into the clearing, my grandfather's charm clutched tight in my hand. I could feel the Wendigo's presence, the weight of its hunger bearing down on me like a physical force. But I stood my ground, my eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the tree line, and I waited for it to come. The Wendigo emerged from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, its gaunt, emaciated form moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its eyes were hollow pits, glittering with a feral, hungry light, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with jagged, yellowed teeth. I felt a wave of terror wash over me as it approached, my legs trembling beneath me, my heart pounding in my chest. But I forced myself to stand my ground, to look into those empty, soulless eyes and see the creature for what it truly was. And in that moment I understood. The Wendigo was not some external force, some malevolent spirit that had chosen me as its prey. It was a part of me, a manifestation of my own fears and doubts, my own hunger and emptiness. I had spent so long running from it, trying to escape the darkness within myself, that I had never stopped to confront it head-on. But now, standing there in that clearing, with the weight of my grandfather's wisdom behind me, I knew what I had to do. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, and let go of everything that had been holding me back. I let go of my fear, my anger, my despair, and I embraced the emptiness within me, the void that could never be filled. And as I did, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, a calm that I had never known before. The Wendigo's presence seemed to fade, its hunger no longer a tangible force, and I knew that I had won. I opened my eyes and saw my grandfather standing before me, a proud smile on his weathered face. "You have done well," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You have faced your demons and emerged stronger for it." I nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over me. I knew that I still had a long way to go, that the hunger within me would never truly be gone, but I also knew that I had the strength to face it, to keep moving forward no matter what challenges lay ahead. As I turned to leave the clearing, I paused, looking back at my grandfather one last time. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse with emotion, "for everything." He nodded, his eyes twinkling with a knowing light. "Remember," he said, "the Wendigo may always be with you, but it does not define you. You are stronger than your hunger, stronger than your fear. Never forget that." And with those words echoing in my mind, I stepped out of the clearing and back into the world, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The Wendigo might always be a part of me, but it would never control me again. I was free at last, to live my life on my own terms and to find my own way forward, no matter where the path might lead. The trouble with Pine Ridge wasn't the people, though they could be a strange bunch. It was the forest, always something about that damn forest. My name is Bart Crowley, and I never really fit in anywhere. Life had a way of knocking me down, but I always got back up. That was until the summer of 1993, when I learned that some hits are meant to put you down for good. I had just moved into a little cabin on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, trying to get away from the mess I'd made back in San Francisco. The town seemed like a good place to start fresh, even if it did have that eerie reputation. The cabin was simple, but it had all I needed: a bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with a fireplace. The surrounding woods provided a sense of isolation that I craved. As I unpacked my meager belongings, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The forest pressed close to the cabin, its dense canopy blocking out much of the sunlight. Even in the middle of the day, shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. The first week passed in a blur of setting up and getting to know the lay of the land. I made a few trips into town for supplies, nodding politely to the locals but keeping my distance. Their wary glances and hushed whispers when they thought I wasn't looking didn't escape my notice. It was clear that outsiders weren't common in Pine Ridge. On my last trip to the general store, I overheard a conversation that made my skin crawl. Two old-timers were huddled in a corner, their voices low but urgent. "Another one gone missing up in the North Woods," one of them said, shaking his head. "Third one this year." "Damn forest takes what it wants," the other replied, his eyes darting around as if afraid the trees themselves might be listening. "Best to stay clear, especially after dark." I brushed it off as small-town superstition, but their words stuck with me, a splinter in my mind that I couldn't quite shake loose. As Friday night rolled around, I found myself sitting on the cabin's small porch, nursing a beer and staring into the gathering darkness. The forest seemed to come alive at night, filled with rustling leaves and distant, unidentifiable sounds. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine and something else, something old and musty that I couldn't quite place. I decided then that I needed to face whatever it was that had the locals so spooked. Tomorrow, I'd take a hike into those woods and see for myself what all the fuss was about. Little did I know that decision would change my life forever. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear. I woke early, my mind already racing with thoughts of the day ahead. As I sipped my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see a face peering back at me from the tree line, but there was nothing, just the endless sea of green, swaying gently in the morning breeze. I packed a small rucksack with water, some energy bars, and a basic first aid kit. As an afterthought, I grabbed the hunting knife my father had given me years ago. I'd never been much for hunting, but having it made me feel a little more prepared for whatever I might encounter. The trail started just behind my cabin, a narrow path that snaked its way into the heart of the forest. As I set out, the morning dew soaked through my boots, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. The first mile or so was pleasant enough. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds chirped overhead, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. But as I ventured deeper, the atmosphere began to change. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The air became thick and heavy, filled with the musty scent I'd noticed the night before. The bird songs faded away, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But I couldn't ignore the way the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, or how my eyes kept darting from shadow to shadow, searching for something. Around noon I came across a small clearing. Sunlight streamed down, a welcome respite from the gloom of the dense forest. I decided to take a break, sitting on a fallen log and pulling out one of my energy bars. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, or thought I did. A shadow, large and fleeting, moved just beyond the tree line. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced as I stood up, peering into the darkness between the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and afraid in the vast silence of the forest. There was no response, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to rationalize it, a deer maybe, or even a bear. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something that didn't belong in these woods any more than I did. With shaking hands, I packed up my things and started back the way I came. But nothing looked familiar. The trail seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember, leading me deeper into the forest instead of back to my cabin. Panic began to set in as I realized I was lost. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly at them. And all the while, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. As the day wore on and the light began to fade, I knew I was in trouble. I'd been walking for hours, and there was still no sign of my cabin or the edge of the forest. The temperature dropped, and a thick mist began to roll in, further obscuring my surroundings. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something in between that sent chills down my spine. And it was close. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my belt. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the snap of a branch somewhere to my left. Slowly I turned towards the noise, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. And there, in the gathering gloom, I saw a pair of eyes watching me. They glowed with an unnatural light, and as I stared, unable to look away, I realized they were set in a face that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. The creature stepped forward, and I got my first clear look at what had been stalking me through the forest. It was then that I knew, with absolute certainty, that my life would never be the same again. The creature that emerged from the shadows defied description, a nightmarish blend of man and beast that sent waves of primal terror coursing through my body. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its body gaunt and twisted, covered in matted fur that seemed to absorb the fading light. But it was the face that truly horrified me, a grotesque mockery of human features stretched over an elongated skull, with eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intelligence. I stood frozen, unable to run, unable even to breathe. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with an almost curious expression. Then, without warning, it let out that bone-chilling sound again, a low guttural noise that seemed to reverberate through the very trees around us. My survival instincts finally kicked in, and I turned to run, but the forest floor, treacherous with roots and fallen branches, conspired against me. I stumbled, my ankle twisting painfully as I fell. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp pain, and ran blindly through the woods. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts. My lungs burned with each desperate breath. Behind me, I could hear the creature in pursuit, its movements unnaturally fast and fluid through the dense undergrowth. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish chase, but eventually my body betrayed me. My legs gave out and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I rolled onto my back, expecting to see the creature looming over me, but there was nothing, just the silent, indifferent forest stretching out in every direction. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I took stock of my situation. I was hopelessly lost, injured, and night was falling fast. And somewhere out there, that thing was still hunting me. I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I had to keep moving, had to find my way back to the cabin. Using a fallen branch as a makeshift crutch, I pushed myself to my feet and started limping in what I hoped was the direction of home. The forest had taken on a dreamlike quality in the twilight, shadows merging and shifting in ways that played tricks on my eyes. More than once I thought I saw the creature watching me from behind a tree or crouched in the underbrush, only for it to vanish when I looked directly at it. As full darkness fell, a new terror gripped me. I was trapped in this forest with that monster, blind and helpless. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the scurrying of small animals, sent fresh waves of fear through me. I stumbled on, using my hands to feel my way forward, jumping at every real or imagined noise. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. I was exhausted, my ankle throbbing with each step, my mind reeling from the impossible encounter. That's when I saw it, a faint glimmer of light through the trees. Hope surged through me. My cabin. Somehow, miraculously, I'd found my way back. I limped faster, ignoring the pain, fixated on that promise of safety. As I broke through the tree line, I nearly wept with relief at the sight of my small cabin. I staggered to the door, fumbling with the key, constantly glancing over my shoulder at the dark forest behind me. Finally inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, then collapsed to the floor, my back against the solid wood. I was safe. I was home. But as my racing heart began to slow, a new, horrible realization dawned on me. I wasn't safe at all. I'd seen something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist, and now it knew where I lived. As if in response to my thoughts, a heavy thud shook the cabin door behind me, then another and another. Something wanted in, and the thin wooden walls suddenly felt terribly, hopelessly inadequate. The pounding on the door intensified, each impact sending vibrations through my body. I scrambled away, my eyes darting around the cabin for anything I could use as a weapon. My gaze fell on the old hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, a relic left by the cabin's previous owner that I'd never thought I'd need. With shaking hands, I grabbed the rifle and checked the chamber. It was loaded. I'd never been much of a shot, but at that moment that rifle felt like my only lifeline. The assault on the door stopped as suddenly as it had begun, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even more terrifying. I stood in the center of the room, rifle pointed at the door, straining to hear any sound of movement outside. Minutes ticked by, each second stretching into an eternity. Then a new sound, a slow, deliberate scratching along the outside wall of the cabin. It moved from one side to the other as if the creature was testing the structure, looking for weaknesses. I pivoted slowly, trying to track the sound, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The scratching stopped at one of the windows, and I caught a glimpse of movement in the darkness beyond the glass. Those glowing eyes appeared, peering in at me with that same unnerving intelligence I'd seen in the forest. Our gazes locked, and in that moment I felt something brush against my mind, an alien presence, cold and ancient and utterly inhuman. I recoiled both physically and mentally, nearly dropping the rifle in shock. The eyes disappeared, and the scratching resumed its circuit around the cabin. I realized with growing horror that the creature was toying with me, drawing out the siege to wear down my defenses. As the night wore on, the psychological toll began to mount. The creature would disappear for long stretches, leaving me in suspense, jumping at every creak of the cabin's old wood. Then it would return, scratching at the walls or windows, occasionally throwing its weight against the door in a bone-jarring impact. I didn't dare sleep, didn't dare take my eyes off the points of entry for even a moment. My body ached from the constant tension, and my injured ankle throbbed mercilessly. But worse than the physical discomfort was the mental strain. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. I found myself questioning my own senses, wondering if I was losing my grip on reality. Was this creature really out there, or had I imagined the whole thing, driven mad by the isolation and the whispered legends of the forest? But then those eyes would appear again at a window, or that unearthly howl would pierce the night, and I knew with sickening certainty that this was all too real. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the siege suddenly intensified. The creature threw itself against the door with renewed vigor, the wood creaking and splintering under the assault. I realized with a jolt of terror that it was making its final push, unwilling to let its prey escape. The door burst inward in a shower of splinters, and the creature barreled into the cabin. I raised the rifle and fired, the shot deafening in the confined space. The creature staggered but didn't fall. I fired again and again, each impact driving it back but seemingly doing little real damage. In desperation, I lunged for the kitchenette, grabbing a cast-iron skillet from the stove. As the creature came at me again, I swung with all my might, connecting with its head in a sickening crunch. The thing went down, twitching and writhing on the floor. Without thinking, I brought the skillet down again and again, driven by pure survival instinct and blind terror. When I finally came to my senses, the creature lay still. Dark, viscous fluid that I hesitated to call blood pooled around its misshapen head. I stood there panting, the skillet still clutched in my trembling hands, waiting for it to move again. But it didn't. Somehow, impossibly, I had survived the night. As sunlight began to filter into the destroyed cabin, I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by exhaustion and the sheer improbability of my continued existence. I didn't know what this thing was or where it had come from, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I couldn't stay in Pine Ridge, not for one more night, not for one more hour. With that thought driving me, I began to pack, casting frequent glances at the motionless form on my cabin floor. I had to get out. I had to get far, far away from this place and never look back. The drive out of Pine Ridge was a blur. I threw what little I owned into my beat-up old truck and hit the road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as I resisted the urge to look back. Every shadow on the road made me flinch. Every unexpected sound had me swerving. I half expected to see that creature in my rearview mirror, somehow alive and in pursuit, but nothing followed me. As the miles stretched out behind me and the sun climbed higher in the sky, I began to feel the first stirrings of relief. I'd made it. I'd survived. It wasn't until I crossed the state line that I allowed myself to really think about what had happened. The reality of the situation crashed down on me like a physical weight. I'd encountered something impossible, something that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares and horror movies, and I'd killed it, or at least I thought I had. A wave of nausea hit me, and I had to pull over to the side of the road. I stumbled out of the truck and emptied the meager contents of my stomach onto the sun-baked asphalt. As I straightened up, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand, a horrible thought struck me. What if it wasn't dead? What if it had just been stunned, playing possum until I left? The image of those inhuman eyes snapping open as soon as my truck pulled away from the cabin filled my mind. I leaned against the truck, suddenly lightheaded. No, I couldn't think like that. It was dead. It had to be dead. I'd seen the damage I'd done, felt the sickening impact of metal on bone. Nothing could have survived that, right? But even as I tried to reassure myself, doubt gnawed at me. I realized with a sinking feeling that I would never truly know for certain. That uncertainty would haunt me for years to come. I got back in the truck and kept driving, putting as much distance between myself and Pine Ridge as I could. I ended up in a small town in Oregon, about as far from dense forest as I could get. I found a cheap apartment and a job at a local garage, trying to piece together some semblance of a normal life. But normalcy was elusive. Sleep became my enemy. Every night I'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, convinced I'd heard that unearthly howl or caught a glimpse of those glowing eyes outside my window. I started sleeping with the lights on, a baseball bat within easy reach. During the day, I'd jump at unexpected noises, my heart racing at the slightest provocation. Shadows seemed to move in my peripheral vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly at them. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the trauma of that night manifesting itself in 1,000 little ways. But that knowledge didn't make it any easier to bear. I tried to talk about it once, to a girl I'd been seeing for a few weeks. She listened with growing disbelief as I haltingly recounted my experience in Pine Ridge. When I finished, she gave me a look of mingled pity and fear, made some excuse about an early morning, and left. I never saw her again. After that, I kept it to myself. What was the point? No one would believe me, Hell, half the time I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd had some kind of mental break, conjured up a monster to explain away my own failings and fears. But then I'd catch sight of the scars on my body, claw marks on my arms from my desperate flight through the forest, the slight limp from my twisted ankle that never quite healed right. And I'd know it had been real, all of it. Months passed, then years. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the acute terror began to fade, replaced by a constant low-level anxiety that became my new normal. I learned to function, to go through the motions of everyday life, but I never truly relaxed. I was always watching, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was a Friday night, nearly 2 years after my escape from Pine Ridge, when everything changed again. I was sitting at the bar of my local watering hole, nursing a beer and trying to ignore the basketball game blaring on the TV overhead. That's when he sat down next to me. He was an older guy, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and sharp, intelligent eyes. He ordered a whiskey, neat, then turned to me with a look that made my blood run cold. "You're Crowley, right?" he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The guy from Pine Ridge?" I tensed, ready to bolt. How did he know? Who was he? But before I could respond, he continued, "Name's Quinn Hargrave. I used to be a ranger up in those parts, heard about your encounter." I stared at him, my mind racing. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading for 2 years. Someone had come to drag me back into that nightmare. "I believe you, son," he said, taking a sip of his whiskey, "because you're not the first, and I'm damn sure you won't be the last." Quinn's words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I felt a mix of emotions wash over me, relief at being believed, fear at the confirmation that what I'd experienced was real, and a burning curiosity to know more. "What do you mean I'm not the first?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Quinn glanced around the bar, then leaned in closer. "Not here," he said. "Too many ears. You got a place we can talk privately?" Every instinct told me to say no, to run as far and as fast as I could from this man and the memories he was dredging up. But a deeper part of me, the part that had been seeking answers for 2 long years, wouldn't let me walk away. I nodded, paid for our drinks, and led Quinn back to my small apartment. As we entered, I couldn't help but feel exposed, vulnerable. I'd spent so long trying to forget, to move on, and now I was inviting the past right back into my life. Quinn settled into my worn armchair while I perched on the edge of the couch, tense and ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Old habits die hard. "I've been tracking these incidents for nearly 30 years now," Quinn began, his eyes distant. "Started back when I was just a rookie ranger, fresh out of training. Found a hiker, or what was left of him, up in the North Woods. Official report said it was a bear attack, but I knew better. Bears don't leave claw marks 8 feet up a tree trunk." I shuddered, remembering the impossible reach of the creature I'd encountered. "Over the years, I started to piece things together," Quinn continued. "Disappearances, strange sightings, livestock mutilations, all centered around Pine Ridge and that damn forest. Most folks wrote it off as tall tales or superstition. But I knew there was something out there, something that didn't fit into our neat little view of the world." "What is it?" I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Quinn shook his head. "Wish I could tell you, son. Native legends talk about skinwalkers, shapeshifters that blur the line between man and beast. Some think it's some kind of undiscovered species, an evolutionary offshoot that's managed to stay hidden. Me? I don't put a name to it. Names have power, and the last thing we need is to give these things more power than they already have." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather notebook. "I've documented everything I could find. Eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, patterns of activity. It's not much, but it's a start." As Quinn flipped through the pages, I saw crude sketches that matched my memories all too well. Long, gangly limbs, glowing eyes, that twisted, not quite human face. My hands began to shake. "Why are you telling me this?" I managed to ask. Quinn's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of determination and what looked like guilt. "Because you're one of the few who've encountered these things and lived to tell about it. And because I need your help." "My help?" I echoed, disbelief coloring my voice. "I've spent 2 years trying to forget what happened, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. And now you want me to, what, go hunting for these monsters? Not hunting, Quinn said, shaking his head. Documenting, understanding. These things are out there, whether we like it or not. The more we know about them, the better chance we have of protecting ourselves and others. I stood up, pacing the small confines of my apartment. You're insane. I can't go back there. I won't. Quinn watched me, his expression understanding but unyielding. You don't have to go back to Pine Ridge. These things, they're not confined to one forest. They're spreading, Crowley. Reports are coming in from all over the Pacific Northwest. Oregon, Washington, even parts of Northern California. They're getting bolder and people are dying. His words hit me like a physical blow. I'd thought I was safe here, that I'd left the nightmare behind in Pine Ridge. But if what Quinn was saying was true, what exactly are you proposing? I asked, my voice tight. Quinn leaned forward, his eyes intense. I'm putting together a team, people who've encountered these things and survived, people with skills we can use. We track sightings, gather evidence, try to understand what we're dealing with, and when necessary, we intervene. I shook my head, a humorless laugh escaping me. You're talking about some kind of monster hunting squad? This isn't a movie, Quinn. These things are real, and they're deadly. I know that better than most, Quinn said, his voice suddenly hard. I've lost friends to these creatures. Good people who didn't deserve what happened to them. I'm not asking you to be a hero, Crowley. I'm asking you to help prevent what happened to you from happening to others. His words struck a chord. How many nights had I lain awake, wondering if I could have done something differently, if I could have warned someone, saved someone. I need to think about this, I said finally. Quinn nodded, standing up. He placed his notebook on the coffee table. Take your time, read through this. If you decide you want in, my number's on the last page. If not, burn it. But whatever you decide, watch your back. Because now that you know, really know, you can't unknow it. And knowledge, in this case, is both power and danger. As Quinn left, I sank back onto the couch, my eyes fixed on the innocent-looking notebook. I knew that opening it would change everything again. But I also knew that I couldn't walk away, not now. Not when I finally had a chance to make sense of what had happened to me. With a deep breath, I reached for the notebook, ready to dive back into the nightmare I'd spent so long trying to escape. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled research. Quinn's notebook was a Pandora's box of horrors, each page revealing new depths to the nightmare I thought I'd left behind. Sketches, witness accounts, and theories filled the worn pages, painting a picture of a hidden world existing alongside our own, full of creatures that defied explanation. I cross-referenced Quinn's notes with news reports and online forums, uncovering a pattern of unexplained disappearances and strange sightings that stretched back decades. The more I dug, the more I realized that what I'd experienced in Pine Ridge was just the tip of a very large, very dangerous iceberg. On the third day, as I sat surrounded by printouts and empty coffee cups, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. Crowley, Quinn's gruff voice came through before I could even say hello. We've got a situation. How fast can you get to Brookings? I hesitated, my mind racing. Brookings was a small coastal town in southern Oregon, about a 5-hour drive from where I was. I haven't decided yet, Quinn. I told you I needed time. Time's up, son, Quinn replied, his tone urgent. There's been an attack. 2 hikers missing, 1 found. Well, let's just say it matches the pattern. Local authorities are calling it a bear attack, but we both know better. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it, the moment of truth. I could hang up, pack my bags, and run again. Find some remote corner of the world and pray that these things never found me. Or I could face my fears head-on, maybe even help prevent others from going through what I had. Give me the details, I heard myself say. I'll be there as soon as I can. The drive to Brookings was tense, every mile bringing me closer to a confrontation I'd been avoiding for years. I'd packed hastily clothes, Quinn's notebook, and the old hunting rifle I'd bought after leaving Pine Ridge. I told myself it was just a precaution, but deep down, I knew better. Quinn met me at a small motel on the outskirts of town. He looked older than I remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes shadowed with fatigue and worry. "Glad you made it," he said, ushering me into his room. Inside, maps and photographs were spread across every available surface. Two other people looked up as we entered, a woman with short graying hair and a scar running down the left side of her face, and a younger man with haunted eyes that I recognized all too well. They'd seen what I'd seen. They knew. "This is Mara," Quinn introduced the woman, ex-military trained tracker, "and this is Ethan. He's got a knack for patterns, helps us predict where these things might show up next." I nodded to them both, feeling a strange mix of comfort and unease at being around others who understood. "What's the situation?" I asked, focusing on the task at hand. Quinn pointed to a map of the nearby Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. 2 days ago, a couple of college kids went hiking here. Only one made it back, babbling about monsters in the woods. Search and rescue found what was left of his friend yesterday morning. I swallowed hard, pushing down the memories that threatened to overwhelm me. "And you're sure it's one of them?" Mara spoke up, her voice surprisingly soft. "The claw marks, the level of destruction. It fits the profile. Plus, there have been reports of strange noises and livestock disappearances in the area for weeks now." "We think it's establishing a new hunting ground," Ethan added, his fingers tracing a pattern on one of the maps. "If we're right, it'll strike again soon." I looked at the three of them, these strangers who were now my allies in a war I never asked to be part of. "So what's the plan? We can't exactly go to the authorities with this." Quinn's expression was grim. "We go in ourselves, track this thing, gather what evidence we can, and if necessary, we put it down." The finality in his voice sent a chill down my spine. This was real. We were really going to hunt one of these creatures. As if reading my thoughts, Quinn placed a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to come on the hunt if you're not ready, but we could use your experience, your insight." I looked at the maps, at the photos of the forest that looked so much like the one that had nearly claimed my life. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this as possible. But I knew I couldn't, not again, not when I had the chance to make a difference. "I'm in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Whatever it takes, I'm in." Quinn nodded, a mix of relief and determination in his eyes. "All right, people. We move out at first light, get some rest. Tomorrow we hunt." As the others began to prepare, I stepped outside, needing a moment to process everything. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of the nearby ocean. I looked up at the stars, so bright and clear away from the city lights. Somewhere out there, in the darkness of the forest, a monster was waiting. But this time I wasn't alone. This time I was ready, or so I hoped. The pre-dawn air was thick with fog as we made our way into the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. The world seemed muffled, every sound dampened by the heavy mist that clung to the trees. It was eerily reminiscent of that fateful day in Pine Ridge, and I had to consciously control my breathing to keep the panic at bay. We moved in a tight formation, Quinn in the lead, then Mara, myself, and Ethan bringing up the rear. Each of us was armed. Quinn and Mara with high-powered rifles, Ethan with a tranquilizer gun, his idea in case we had a chance to capture rather than kill, and me with my trusty hunting rifle. As we penetrated deeper into the forest, the fog began to lift, revealing the wild beauty of the landscape. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated it, but now every shadow held a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a possible ambush. Hours passed as we followed the trail Quinn and Mara had pieced together from ranger reports and their own reconnaissance. The forest grew denser, the underbrush thicker. It was slow going, and the tension was palpable. It was nearing midday when Mara suddenly held up a hand, freezing us in our tracks. She crouched down, examining something on the forest floor that I couldn't see. "Tracks," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fresh, within the last hour." Quinn moved up to examine them, his face grim. "It's close, be ready." We continued on, moving slower now, every sense on high alert. The forest had gone quiet. No bird calls, no skittering of small animals. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement in my peripheral vision, gone almost before I could register it. I spun, raising my rifle, but there was nothing there. "Did you see?" I started to ask, But Quinn cut me off with a sharp gesture. He'd seen it too. We all had. We formed a tight circle, backs to each other, scanning the surrounding forest. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the others could hear it. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. It burst from the underbrush like a force of nature, all sinewy limbs and matted fur. In the daylight, it was even more terrifying than I remembered, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence, its mouth a jagged maw of razor-sharp teeth. Gunshots rang out, deafening in the confined space of the forest. The creature moved with impossible speed, dodging and weaving through our fire. I caught a glimpse of Mara going down, her rifle flying from her hands as the beast's claws raked across her arm. Quinn was shouting orders, trying to coordinate our defense, but the chaos of the moment made it nearly impossible to hear him. Ethan was fumbling with his tranquilizer gun, his face pale with terror. And then it was on me. The world narrowed to those glowing eyes and gnashing teeth. I fired, the recoil of the rifle slamming into my shoulder, but the creature was too fast. It knocked me off my feet, and I felt a searing pain across my chest as its claws found their mark. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. The creature loomed over me, its hot, fetid breath washing over my face. In that moment, I was sure I was going to die. But then Quinn was there, emptying his rifle into the beast's side. It let out an ear-splitting howl of pain and rage, turning its attention to this new threat. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the burning pain in my chest, and raised my rifle again. What followed was a desperate, chaotic battle. We fought with everything we had, driven by pure survival instinct. Ethan managed to get off a shot with the tranquilizer, the dart finding its mark in the creature's thick hide. But it seemed to only enrage the beast further. In the end, it was Mara who turned the tide. Despite her injured arm, she managed to circle behind the creature while it was focused on Quinn and me. With a war cry that would have put fear into the heart of any natural predator, she emptied her sidearm into the back of the beast's head. The creature went down, twitching and howling. We didn't stop firing until it lay still, its body riddled with bullets. As the echo of the last shot faded away, an eerie silence fell over the forest. We stood there, panting and bleeding, staring at the motionless form of our nightmarish foe. Is it dead?" Ethan asked, his voice shaky. Quinn approached cautiously, his rifle still trained on the creature. He prodded it with the barrel of his gun. No response. "Yeah," he said, his voice a mix of relief and disbelief. "Yeah, it's dead." The adrenaline began to wear off, and the pain of my injuries hit me full force. I sank to my knees, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Mara was already pulling out a first aid kit, her military training kicking in as she began to treat our wounds. As she worked, the reality of what we'd just accomplished began to sink in. We'd done it. We'd faced the monster and won. It hadn't been pretty, it hadn't been easy, but we'd survived. As Mara bandaged my chest, I looked at my newfound companions. We were battered, bloody, and shaken, but there was a newfound strength in our eyes. We'd faced our worst nightmares and come out the other side. Quinn was on his satellite phone, calling in a team to help clean up and document our kill. Ethan was taking samples and measurements of the creature, his scientific curiosity overcoming his fear. And me? I felt something I hadn't felt in years, hope. We'd proven that these creatures could be fought, could be beaten. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be dangerous. But for the first time since that night in Pine Ridge, I felt like I had a purpose. As we made our way out of the forest, supporting each other, I knew that this was just the beginning. There were more creatures out there, more battles to be fought. But we'd be ready, we'd be stronger, and we'd face whatever came next, together. The nightmare wasn't over. In many ways it was just beginning. But now at least we had a fighting chance. And as we emerged from the trees, the sun breaking through the clouds felt like a promise of better days to come. The forest behind us held its secrets, its dangers, but we'd faced them, and we'd survived. Whatever came next, whatever horrors awaited us in the shadows, we'd be ready. Because now we knew the truth. The monsters were real, but so were the heroes who fought them. And I, Bart Crowley, once a man running from his past, had finally found my place in this strange, terrifying, wonderful world.